Chapter 14 of The Life Everlasting by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Statler. Cross and Star. The moon rose slowly between two bars of dark cloud, which gradually whitened into silver beneath her shining presence, and a scintillating pathway of diamond-like reflections began to spread itself across the sea. I remained at the window, feeling an odd disinclination to turn away into the darkness of my room. And I began to think that perhaps it was rather hard that I should be left all by myself, locked up in this way. Surely I might have been allowed a light of some sort. Then I at once reproached myself for allowing the merest suggestion of a complaint to enter my mind, for, after all, I was an uninvited guest in the house of Aselzion. I was not wanted, and I remembered the order that had been issued concerning me. The moment she desires to leave, every facility for departure is to be granted to her. I was much more afraid of this facility for departure than I was of my present solitude, and I determined to look upon the whole adventure in the best and most cheerful light. If it was best I should be alone, then loneliness was good. If it was necessary I should be in darkness, then darkness was also agreeable to me. Scarcely had I thus made up my mind to these conditions, when my room was suddenly illumined by a soft yet effulgent radiance, and I started up in amazement, wondering where it came from. I could see no lamps or electric burners. It was as if the walls glowed with some surface luminance. When my first surprise had passed, I was charmed and delighted with the warm and comforting brightness around me. It rather reminded me of the electric brilliancy on the sails of the Dream. I moved away from the window, leaving it open, as the night was very close and warm, and sat down at the table to read a little, but after a few minutes laid the book aside to listen to a strange whispering music that floated toward me, apparently from the sea, and thrilled me to the soul. No eloquent description could give any idea of the enthralling sweetness of the harmonies that were more breathed upon the air than sounded, and I became absorbed in following the rhythm of these delicious cadences as they rose and fell. Then, by degrees, my thoughts wandered away to Raphael Santoris. Where was he now? In what peaceful expanse of shining waters had his fairy vessel cast anchor? I pictured him in my brain till I could almost see his face, the broad brow, the fearless tender eyes and smile, and I could fancy that I heard the deep soft accents of his voice, always so gentle when he spoke to me who had half resented his influence, and a quick wave of long pent-up tenderness rose in my heart. My whole soul ran out, as it were, to greet him with outstretched arms. I knew in my own consciousness that he was more than all the world to me, and I said aloud, "My beloved, I love you, I love you," to the silence, almost as if I thought it could convey the words to him whom most I desired to hear them. Then I felt how foolish and futile it was to talk to the empty air, when I might have confessed myself to the real lover of my life face to face, had I been less sceptical, less proud. Was not my very journey to the house of Aselzion a testimony of my own doubting attitude? For I had come, as I now admitted to myself, first, to make sure that Aselzion really existed, and secondly, to prove to my own satisfaction that he was truly able to impart the mystical secrets which Raphael seemed to know. I wearied myself out at last with thinking to no purpose, and closing the window, I undressed and went to bed. As I lay down, the light in my room was suddenly extinguished, and all was darkness again, except for the moon, which sent a clear white ray straight through the lattice, there being no curtain to shut it out. For some time I remained awake on my hard little couch, looking at this ray, and steadily refusing to allow any sense of fear or loneliness to gain the mastery over me. The music which had so enchanted me ceased, and everything was perfectly still, and by my eyes closed, my tired limbs relaxed, and I fell into a sound and dreamless sleep. When I awoke, it was full morning, and the sunshine poured into my room like a shower of gold. I sprang up, full of delight that the night had passed so peacefully, and that nothing strange or terrifying had occurred, though I do not know why I should have expected this. Everything seemed wonderfully fresh and beautiful in the brightness of the new day, and the very plainness of my room had a fascination greater than any amount of luxury. The only unusual thing I noticed was that the soft cold water with which my bath was supplied sparkled as though it were effervescent. Once or twice it seemed to ripple with a diamond-like foam, and it was never actually still. I watched its glittering movements for some minutes before bathing. Then, feeling certain it was charged with some kind of electricity, I plunged into it without hesitation, and enjoyed to the utmost the delicious sense of invigoration it gave me. When my toilette was completed, and I had attired myself in a simple morning gown of white linen, as being more suited to the warmth of the weather than the black one I had travelled in, I went to throw open my window and let in all the freshness of the sea air, and was surprised to see a small, low door open in the side of the turret, through which I discovered a winding stair leading downward. Yielding to the impulse of the moment, I descended it, and at the end found myself in an exquisite little rock garden abutting on the seashore. I could actually open a gate and walk to the very edge of the sea. I was no longer a prisoner then. I could run away if I chose. I looked about me, and smiled as I saw the impossibility of any escape. The little garden belonged exclusively to the turret, and on each side of it impassable rocks towered up almost to the height of the Château d'Aselzion itself, while the bit of shore on which I stood was equally hemmed in by huge boulders, against which the waves had dashed for centuries without making much visible impression. Yet it was delightful to feel I was allowed some liberty and open air, and I stayed for some minutes watching the sea and revelling in the warmth of this southern sun. Then I retraced my steps slowly, looking everywhere about me as I went, to see if there was anyone near. Not a soul was in sight. I returned to my room to find my bed made as neatly as though it had never been slept upon, and my breakfast, consisting of a cup of milk and some wheaten biscuits, set out upon the table. I was quite ready for the meal, and enjoyed it. When I had finished, I took my empty cup and plate, and put them on the dresser in the niche, whereupon the dresser was instantly lowered, and very soon disappeared. Then I began to wonder how I should employ myself. It was no use writing letters. Though I had my own travelling desk ready for this purpose, I did not wish my friends or acquaintances to know where I was, and even if I had written to any of them, it was hardly likely that my correspondence would ever reach them, for I felt sure the mystic brotherhood of Aselzion would not allow me to communicate with the outside world so long as I remained with them. I sat meditating, and I began to consider that several days passed thus aimlessly would be difficult to bear. I could not keep correct count of time, my watch having stopped, and there was no clock or chime of any sort in the place that I could hear. The stillness around me would have been oppressive but for the soft dash of little waves breaking on the beach below my window. All at once, to my great joy, the door of my room opened, and the personage called Honorius entered. He bent his head slightly, by way of salutation, and then said briefly, "You are commanded to follow me." I rose obediently and stood ready. He looked at me intently and with curiosity, as though he sought to read my mind. Remembering that Aselzion had said I was not to speak unless spoken to, I only returned his look steadfastly and with a smile. "You are not unhappy or afraid or restless," he said slowly. "That is well. You are making a good beginning. And now, whatever you see or hear, keep silence. If you desire to speak, speak now. But after we leave this room, not a word must escape your lips, not a single exclamation. Your business is to listen, learn, and obey." He waited, giving me the opportunity to say something in reply, but I preferred to hold my peace. He then handed me a folded length of soft white material, opaque yet fine and silky as gossamer. "Cover yourself with this veil," he said, "and do not raise it till you return here." I unfolded it and threw it quickly over me. It was as delicate as a filmy cloud, and draped me from head to foot, effectually concealing me from the eyes of others, though I myself could see through it perfectly. Honorius then signed to me to follow, and I did so, my heart beating quickly with excitement and expectation. We went through many passages with intricate turnings that seemed to have no outlet. It was like threading one's way through a maze, till at last I found myself shut within a small cell-like place with an opening in front of me, through which I gazed upon a strange and picturesque scene. I saw the interior of a small but perfectly beautiful Gothic chapel, exquisitely designed, and lit by numerous windows of stained glass, through which the sunlight filtered in streams of radiant colour, patterning with gold, crimson, and blue the white marble flooring below. Between every tapering column that supported the finely carved roof were 2 rows of benches, one above the other, and here sat an array of motionless white figures, men in the garb of their mysterious order, their faces almost concealed by their drooping cowls. There was no altar in this chapel, but at its eastern end, where the altar might have been, was a dark purple curtain against which blazed in brilliant luminance a cross and 7-pointed star. The rays of light shed by this uplifted symbol of an unwritten creed were so vivid as to be almost blinding, and nearly eclipsed the summer glory of the sun itself. Awed by the strange and silent solemnity of my surroundings, I was glad to be hidden under the folds of my enshrouding white veil, though I realized that I was in a sort of secret recess made purposely for the use of those who were summoned to see all that went on in the chapel without being seen. I waited, full of eager anticipation, and presently the low, vibrating sound of the organ trembled on the air, gradually increasing in volume and power till a magnificent rush of music poured from it like a sudden storm breaking through clouds. I drew a long breath of pure ecstasy. I could have knelt and wept tears of gratitude for the mere sense of hearing. Such music was divine. The very idea of mortality was swallowed up in it and destroyed, and the imprisoned soul mounted up to the highest life on wings of light, rejoicing. When it ceased, as it did all too soon, there followed a profound silence, so profound that I could hear the quick beating of my own heart, as if I were the only living thing in the place. I turned my eyes towards the dazzling cross and star with its ever-darting rays of fiery brilliancy, and the effect of its perpetual sparkle of lambent fire was as if an electric current were giving off messages which no mortal skill would ever be able to decipher or put into words, but which found their way to one's deepest inward consciousness. All at once there was a slight movement among the rows of white-garmented, white-cowled figures hitherto sitting so motionless, and with one accord they rose to their feet as a figure, tall, stately, and imposing, came walking slowly across the chapel and stood directly in front of the flaming symbol, holding both hands outstretched as though invoking a blessing. It was the Master, Aselzion invested with such dignity and splendor as I had never thought possible to man. He might have posed for some god or hero. His aspect was one of absolute power and calm self-poise. Other men might entertain doubts of themselves at the intention of their lives, but this one, in his mere bearing, expressed sureness, strength, and authority. He wore his cowl thrown back, and from where I sat in my secluded corner I could see his features distinctly, and could watch the flash of his fine, steadfast eyes as he turned them upon his followers. Keeping his hands extended, he said in a firm, clear voice, "To the Creator of all things visible and invisible, let us offer up our gratitude and praise, and so begin this day." And a responsive murmur of voices answered him. "We praise Thee, O Divine Power of love and life eternal. We praise Thee for all we are. We praise Thee for all we have been. We praise Thee for all we hope to be. Amen." There followed a moment's tense silence. Then the assembled brethren sat down in their places, and Aselzion spoke in measured, distinct accents, with the easy and assured manner of a practised orator. "Friends and brethren, we are gathered here together to consider in this moment of time the things we have done in the past, and the things we are preparing to do in the future. We know that from the past, stretching back into infinity, we have ourselves made the present. And according to divine law, we also know that from this present, stretching forward into infinity, we shall ourselves evolve all that is yet to come. There is no power, no deity, no chance, no fortuitous concurrence of atoms in what is simply a figure of the universal mathematics. Nothing can be forgiven under the eternal law of compensation. Nothing need be prayed for, since everything is designed to accomplish each individual spirit's ultimate good. You are here to learn not only the secret of life, but something of how to live that life, and I, in my capacity, am only striving to teach what nature has been showing you for thousands of centuries, though you have not cared to master her lessons. The science of today is but nature's first primer, a spelling book, as it were, with the alphabet set out in pictures. You are told by sagacious professors, who, after all, are no more than children in their newly studied wisdom, that human life was evolved in the first instance from protoplasm, as they think, but they lack the ability to tell you how the protoplasm was itself evolved, and why, where the material came from that went to the making of millions of solar systems and trillions of living organisms concerning whose existence we have no knowledge or perception. Some of them deny a God, but most of them are driven to confess that there must be an intelligence, supreme and omnipotent, behind the visible universe. Order cannot come out of chaos without a directing mind, and order would be quickly submerged into chaos again, were not the directing mind of a nature to sustain its method and condition. We start, therefore, with this governing intelligence or directing mind, which must, like the brain of man, be dual, combining the male and female attributes, since we see that it expresses itself throughout all creation in dual form and type. Intelligence, mind, or spirit, whichever we may elect to call it, is inherently active and must find an outlet for its powers, and the very fact of this necessity produces desire to perpetuate itself in varied ways. This again is the first attribute of love. Hence, love is the foundation of worlds and the source of all living organisms, the dual atoms or ions of spirit and matter yielding to attraction, union, and reproduction. If we master this fact reasonably and thoroughly, we shall be nearer the comprehension of life. He paused a moment, then advanced a step or two and went on, the flaming symbol behind him seeming literally to envelop him in its beams. What we have to learn first of all is how these laws affect us as individual human beings and as separate personalities. It is necessary to avoid all obscurity of language in setting forth the simple principles which should guide and preserve each human existence, and my explanation shall be as brief and plain as I can make it. Granted that there is a divine mind or governing intelligence behind the infinitude of vital and productive atoms, which in their union and reproduction build up the wonders of the universe, we see and admit that one of the chief results of the working of this divine mind is man. He is, so we have been told, the image of God. This expression may be taken as a poetic line in the Scriptures, meaning no more than poetic imagery, but it is nevertheless a truth. Man is a kind of universe in himself. He, too, is a conglomeration of atoms that are active, reproductive, and desirous of perpetual creativeness. Behind them, as in the nature of the divine, there is the governing intelligence, the mind, the spirit, dual in type, double-sexed in action. Without the mind to control it, the constitution of man is chaos, just as the universe itself would be without the Creator's governance. What we have chiefly to remember is that just as the spirit behind visible nature is divine and eternal, so is the spirit behind each one of our individual selves also divine and eternal. It has been always, it will be always, and we move as distinct personalities through successive phases of life, each one under the influence of his or her own controlling soul, to higher and ever higher perception and attainment. The great majority of the world's inhabitants live with less consciousness of this spirit than flies or worms. They build up religions in which they prate of God and immortality as children prattle, without the smallest effort to understand either. And at the change which they call death, they pass out of this life without having taken the trouble to discover, acknowledge, or use the greatest gift God has bestowed upon them. But we who are here to realize the existence of the all-powerful force which gives us complete mastery over the things of space and time and matter, we who know that over that individual moving universe of atoms called man, it can hold absolute control, we can prove for ourselves that the whole earth is subject to the dominance of the immortal soul. Aye, and the very elements of air, fire, and water, for these are but the ministers and servants to its sovereign authority. He paused again, and after a minute or two of silence, went on. This beautiful earth, this overarching sky, the exquisite things of nature's form and loveliness are all given to man, not only for his material needs, but for his spiritual growth and evolvement. From the light of the sun he may draw fresh warmth and color for his blood. From the air, new supplies of life. From the very trees and herbs and flowers he may renew his strength. And there is nothing created that is not intended to add in some measure to his pleasure and well-being. For if the foundation of the universe be love, as it is, then love desires to see its creatures happy. Misery has no place in the divine scheme of things. It is the result of man's own opposition to natural law. In natural law, all things work calmly, slowly, and steadfastly together for good. Nature silently obeys God's ordinance. Man, on the contrary, questions, argues, denies, rebels, with the result that he scatters his force and fails in his highest effort. It is in his own power to renew his own youth, his own vitality. Yet we see him sink of his own accord into feebleness and decrepitude, giving himself up, as it were, to be devoured by the disintegrating influences which he could easily repel. For, as the directing spirit of God governs the infinitude of atoms and stardust which go to make up universes, so the mind of a man should govern the atoms and stardust of which he himself is composed, guiding their actions and renewing them at pleasure, forming them into suns and systems of thought and creative power, and wasting no particle of his eternal life forces. He can be what he elects to be, a god, or merely one of a mass of units in embryo, drifting away from one phase of existence to another in unintelligent indifference, and so compelling himself to pass centuries of aimless movement before entering upon any marked or decisive path of individual and separate action. The greater number prefer to be nothings in this way, though they cannot escape the universal grinding mill. They must be used for some purpose in the end, be they never so reluctant. Therefore, we, who study the latent powers of man, judge it wiser to meet and accept our destiny, rather than fall back in the race and allow destiny to overtake us, and whip us into place with rods of sharp experience. If there is anyone here present who now desires to speak, to ask a question, or deny a statement, let him come forward boldly and say what he has to say, without fear." As he thus spoke, I, looking from my little hidden recess, saw a movement among the seated brethren. One of them rose, and, descending from his place, walked slowly towards Aselzion till he was within a few paces of him. Then he paused and threw back his cowl, showing a worn, handsome face, on which some great sorrow seemed to be marked too strongly to be ever erased. "I do not wish to live," he said. "I came here to study life, but not to learn how to keep it. I would lose it gladly for the merest trifle, for life is to me a bitter thing, a hideous and inexplicable torment. Why should you, O Aselzion, teach us how to live long? Why not rather teach us how to die soon?" Aselzion's eyes were bent upon him with a grave and tender compassion. "What accusation do you bring against life?" he asked. "How has life wronged you?" "How has life wronged me?" And the unhappy man threw up his hands with a gesture of desperation. "You who profess to read thought and gauge the soul, can you ask? How has life wronged me? By sheer injustice. From my first breath, for I never asked to be born, from my early days when all my youthful dreams and aspirations were checked, smothered, and killed by loving parents, forsooth, whose idea of love was money, every great ambition frustrated, every higher hope slain, and in my own love, that love of woman which is man's chief curse, even she was false and worthless as a spurious coin, caring nothing whether my life was saved or ruined. It was ruined, of course, but what matter? Who need care? Only the weariness of it all, the day after day burden of time, the longing to lie down and hide beneath the comfortable grass in peace, where no false friend, no treacherous love, no kind acquaintances, glad to see me suffer, can ever point their mocking hands or round their cruel eyes at me again. Aselzion, if the God you serve is half as wicked as the men he made, then heaven itself is hell." He spoke deliberately, yet with passion. Aselzion silently regarded him. The fiery cross and star blazed with strange colours like millions of jewels, and the deep stillness in the chapel was for many minutes unbroken. All at once, as though impelled by some irresistible force, he sank on his knees. "Aselzion, as you are strong, have patience with the weak. As you see the divine, pity those who are blind. As you stand firm, stretch a hand to those whose feet are on the shifting quicksands. And if death and oblivion are among the gifts of your bestowal, withhold them not from me, for I would rather die than live." There was a pause. Then Aselzion's voice, calm, clear, and very gentle, vibrated on the silence. "There is no death," he said. "You cannot die. There is no oblivion. You may not forget. There is but one way of life, to live it." Another moment's stillness, then again the steady, resolute voice went on. "You accuse life of injustice. It is you who are unjust to life. Life gave you those dreams and aspirations you speak of. It was in your power to realize them. I say, it was in your power, had you chosen. No parents, no friends, not God himself can stop you from doing what you will to do. Who frustrated any great ambition of yours but yourself? Who can slay a hope but him in whose soul it was born? And that love of woman Was she your true mate, or only a thing of eyes and hair and vanity? Did your passion touch her body only, or did it reach her soul? Did you seek to know whether that soul had ever wakened within her, or were you too well satisfied with her surface beauty to care? In all these things blame yourself, not life, for life gives you earth and heaven, time and eternity for the attainment of joy, joy in which, but for yourself, there would never be a trace of sorrow. The kneeling penitent, for such he now appeared to be, covered his face with his hands. "I cannot give you death," continued Aselzion. "You can take what is called by that name for yourself, if you choose. You can, by your own action, sudden or premeditated, destroy this present form and composition of yourself for just so long as it takes the forces of nature to build you up again, an incredibly brief moment of time. But you gain nothing, you neither lose your consciousness nor your memory. Ponder this well before you pull down your present dwelling-house, for ingratitude breeds narrowness, and your next habitation might be smaller and less fitted for peace and quiet breathing." With these words, gently spoken, he raised the penitent from his knees and signed to him to return to his place. He did so obediently, without another word, pulling his cowl closely about him, so that none of his fellow brethren might see his features. Another man then stepped forward and addressed Aselzion. "Master," he said, "would it not be better to die than to grow old, if, as you teach us, there is no real death? Should there be any real decay? What pleasure is there in life when the strength fails and the pulses slacken, when the warm blood grows chill and stagnant, and when even those we have loved consider we have lived too long? I who speak now am old, though I am not conscious of age, but others are conscious for me. Their looks, their words, imply that I am in their way, that I am slowly dying like a lopped tree, and that the process is too tedious for their impatience. And yet I could be young. My powers of work have increased rather than lessened. I enjoy life more than those that have youth on their side, but I know I carry the burden of 70 years upon me, and I say that surely it is better to die than live even so long." Aselzion, standing in the full light of the glittering cross and star, looked upon him with a smile. "I also carry the burden, if burden you must call it, of 70 years, he said. "But years are nothing to me. They should be nothing to you. Who asked you to count them or to consider them? In the world of wild nature, time is measured by seasons only. The bird does not know how old it is. The rose tree does not count its birthdays. You, whom I know to be a brave man and patient student, have lived the usual life of men in the world. You are wedded to a woman who has never cared to understand the deeper side of your nature, and who is now far older than you, though in actual years younger. You have children who look upon you as their banker merely, and who, while feigning affection, really wait for your death with eagerness in order to possess your fortune. You might as well have never had those children. I know all this as you yourself know it. I also know that through the word impressions and influence of so-called friends who wish to persuade you of your age, the disintegrating process has begun, but this can be arrested. You yourself can arrest it. The dream of Faust is no fallacy, only that the renewal of youth is not the work of magic evil, but of natural good. If you would be young, leave the world as you have known it and begin it anew. Leave wife, children, friends, all that hang like fungi upon an oak, rotting its trunk and sapping its strength without imparting any new form of vitality. Live again, love again. I? And he who was thus spoken to threw back his cowl, showing a face wan and deeply wrinkled, yet striking in its fine intellectuality of feature. I, with these white hairs? You jest with me, Aselzion. "I never jest," replied Aselzion. I leave jesting to the fools who prate of life without comprehending its first beginnings. I do not jest with you. Put me to the proof. Obey my rules here but for 6 months, and you shall pass out of these walls with every force in your body and spirit renewed in youth and vitality. But yourself must work the miracle, which, after all, is no miracle. Yourself must build yourself, as everyone is bound to do who would make the fullest living out of life. If you hesitate, if you draw back, if you turn with one foolish regret or morbid thought to your past mistakes in life which are past, to her, your wife, a wife in name but never in soul, to your children, born of animal instinct but not of spiritual, deep love, to those your friends who count up your years as though they were crimes, you check the work of reinvigoration, and you stultify the forces of renewal. You must choose, and the choice must be voluntary and deliberate, for no man becomes aged and effete without his own intention and inclination to that end, and equally no man retains or renews his youth without a similar intention and inclination. Take 2 days to consider, and then tell me your mind." The man he thus addressed hesitated, as though he had something more to say, then, with a deep obeisance, went back to his place. Aselzion waited till he was seated, and after the brief interval spoke again. "If all of you here present are content with your rule of life in this place, and with your studies you are undertaking, and none of you wish to leave, I ask for the usual sign." All the brethren rose and raised their arms above their heads, dropping them slowly again after a second's pause. "Enough!" And Aselzion now moved towards the cross and star, fronting it fully. As he did so, I saw to my astonishment and something of terror that the rays proceeding from the centre of the symbol flamed out to an extraordinary length, surrounding his whole figure and filling the chapel with a lurid brilliancy as though it were suddenly on fire. Straight into the centre of the glowing flames he steadily advanced, then, at a certain point, turned again and faced his followers. But what an aspect now was his! The light about him seemed to be part of his very body and garments. He was transfigured into the semblance of something godlike and angelic, and I was overcome with fear and awe as I looked upon him. Lifting one hand, he made the sign of the cross, whereat the white-robed brethren descended from their places, and walking one by one in line, came up to him where he stood. He spoke, and his voice rang out like a silver clarion. "O divine light," he exclaimed, "we are a part of thee, and into thee we desire to become absorbed. From thee we know we may obtain an immortality of life upon this gracious earth. O Nature, beloved Mother, whose bosom burns with hidden fires of strength, we are thy children, born of thee in spirit as in matter. In us thou hast distilled thy rains and dews, thy snows and frosts, thy sunlight and thy storm. In us thou hast embodied thy prolific beauty, thy productiveness, thy power, and thy advancement towards good. And more than all, thou hast endowed us with the divine passion of love, which kindles the fire whereof thou art created, and whereby we are sustained. Take us, O Light, keep us, O Nature, and thou, O God, Supreme Spirit of love, whose thought is flame, and whose desire is creation, be thou our guide, supporter and instructor through all worlds without end. Amen. Once more the glorious music of the organ surged through the chapel like a storm, and I, trembling in every limb, knelt, covering my veiled face closely with my hands, overcome by the splendor of the sound and the strangeness of the scene. Gradually, very gradually, the music died away. A deep silence followed, and when I lifted my head the chapel was empty. Aselzion and his disciples had vanished noiselessly, as though they had never been present. Only the cross and star still remained glittering against its dark purple background, darting out long tremulous rays, some of which were pale violet, others crimson, others of the delicate hues of the pink topaz. I looked round, then behind me, and to my surprise saw that the door of my little recess had been unlocked and left open. Acting on an impulse too strong to resist, I stole softly out, and stepping on tiptoe, scarcely daring to breathe, I found my way through a low archway into the body of the chapel, and stood there all alone, my heart beating loudly with positive terror. Yet there was nothing to fear. No one was near me that I could see, but I felt as if there were thousands of eyes watching me from the roof, from behind the columns, and from the stained glass windows that shed their light on the marble pavement. And the glowing radiance of the cross and star in all that stillness was almost terrible. The long bright rays were like tongues of fire, mutely expressing unutterable things. Fascinated, I drew nearer and nearer, then paused abruptly, checked by a kind of vibration under me, as though the ground rocked. Presently, however, I gained fresh courage to go on, and by degrees was drawn into a perfect vortex of light, which rushed upon me like great waves on all sides, so forcibly that I had hardly any knowledge of my own movements. Like a creature in a dream I moved. My very hands looked transparent and spirit-like as I stretched them out towards that marvellous symbol, and when my eyes glanced for a moment at the folds of my covering veil, I saw that its white silkiness shone with a pale amethystine hue. On I went, a desperate idea possessing me to go as far as I could into that strange, starry centre of living luminance. The very boldness of the thought appalled me even while I encouraged it. But step by step I went on resolutely, till I suddenly felt myself caught, as it were, in a wheel of fire. Round and round me it whirled, darting points of radiance as sharp as spears, which seemed to enter my body and stab it through and through. I struggled for breath and tried to draw back. Impossible! I was tangled up in a net of endless light vibrations, which, though they gave forth no heat, yet quivered through my whole being with searching intensity, as though bent on probing to the very centre of my soul. I could not utter a sound. I stood there dumb, immovable, and shrouded in million-coloured flame, too stunned with the shock to realize my own identity. Then, all at once, something dark and cool floated over me like the shadow of a passing cloud. I looked up and strove to utter a cry, a word of appeal, and then fell to the ground, lost in complete unconsciousness. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Life Everlasting by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Statler. A First Lesson. I do not know how long I lay there, lost to sight and sense, but when I came to myself, I was in a quiet, shadowy place, like a kind of little hermitage, with a window opening out upon the sea. I was lying on a couch, with the veil I had worn still covering me, and as I opened my eyes and looked about me, I saw that it was night, and that the moon was tracing a silver network of beams across the waves. There was a delicious fragrance on the air. It came from a group of roses set in a tall crystal vase close to where I lay. Then, as I gradually regained full knowledge of my own existence, I perceived a table in the room with a lamp burning upon it, and at the table sat no less a personage than Aselzion himself, reading. I was so amazed at the sight of him that for the moment I lay inert, afraid to move, for I was almost sure I had incurred his displeasure, till suddenly, with the feeling of a child seeking pardon for an offence, I sprang up and ran to him, throwing myself on my knees at his feet. "Aselzion, forgive me," I murmured. "I have done wrong. I had no right to go so far." He turned his eyes upon me, smiling, and took me gently by the hands. "Who denies your right to go far if you have the strength and courage?" he said. "Dear child, I have nothing to forgive. You are the maker of your own destiny. But you have been bold. Though you are a mere woman, you have dared to do what few men attempt. This is the power of love within you, that perfect love which casteth out fear. You risked a danger which has not harmed you. You have come out of it unscathed. So may it be with every ordeal through which you may yet be tried as by fire." He raised me from where I knelt, but I still held his hands. "I could not help it," I said. "Your command for me was silence and solitude, and in that silence and solitude I remained while I watched you all, and I heard everything that was said. This was your wish and order. And when you all went away, the silence and solitude would have been the same but for that cross and star. They seemed to speak, to call me, to draw me to them, and I went, hardly knowing why, yet feeling that I must go, and then—" Aselzion pressed my hands gently. "Then the light claimed its own," he said, "and courage had its reward. The door of your recess in the chapel was opened by my instructions. I wished to see what you would do. You have no conception as yet of what you have done, but that does not matter. You have passed one test successfully. For had you remained passive in your place till someone came to remove you, I should have known you for a creature of weak will and transitory impulses. But you are stronger than I thought, so tonight I have come to give you your first lesson." "My first lesson?" I repeated the words after him wonderingly, as he let go my hands and put me gently into a chair which I had not perceived, but which stood in the shadow cast by the lamp almost immediately opposite to him. "Yes, your first lesson," he answered, smiling gravely. "The first lesson in what you have come here to learn, the perpetuation of your life on earth for just so long as you desire it, the secret which gives to Raphael Santoris his youth and strength and power, as well as his governance over certain elemental forces. But first take this," and he poured out from a quaintly shaped flask a full glass of deep red-coloured wine. "This is no magic potion. It is simply a form of nourishment which will be safer for you than solid food, and I know you have eaten nothing all day since your light breakfast. Drink it all, every drop." I obeyed. It seemed tasteless and strengthless, like pure water. "Now," he continued, "I will put before you a very simple illustration of the truth which underlies all nature. If you were taken into a vast plain, and there saw two opposing armies, the one actuated by a passion for destruction, the other moved only by a desire for good, you would naturally wish the latter force to win, would you not?" I answered yes at once, without hesitation. "But suppose," he went on, "that both armies were actuated by good, and that the object of the destroying force was only to break down what was effete and mischievous, in order to build it up again in stronger and nobler forms, while the aim of the other was to strictly preserve and maintain the advantages it possessed, which side would then have your sympathy?" I tried to think, but could not instantly determine. "Here is your point of hesitation," he said, "and here the usual limit of human comprehension. Both forces are good, but as a rule we can only side with one. We name that one life, the other death. We think life alone stands for what is living, and that death is a kind of cessation of life, instead of being one of life's most active forms. The universe is entirely composed of these two fighting forces. We call them good and evil, but there is no evil. There is only a destruction of what might be harmful if allowed to exist. To put it clearly, the millions of atoms and electrons which compose the everlasting elements of spirit and matter are dual, that is to say, of two kinds, those which preserve their state of equilibrium, and those whose work is to disintegrate, in order to build up again. As with the universe, so with the composition of a human being. In you, as in myself, there exist these two forces, and our souls are, so to speak, placed on guard between them. The one set of atoms is prepared to maintain the equilibrium of health and life, but if through the neglect and unwatchfulness of the sentinel soul, any of them are allowed to become disused and effete, the other set, whose business it is to disintegrate whatever is faulty and useless for the purpose of renewing it in better form, begins to work. And this disintegrating process is our conception of decay and death. Yet, as a matter of fact, such process cannot even begin without our consent and collusion. Life can be retained in our possession for an indefinite period on this earth, but it can only be done through our own actions, our own wish and will. One may wish and will many things, I said, but the result is not always successful. Is that your experience? He asked, bending his keen eyes full upon me. You know, if you are true to yourself, that no power can resist the insistence of a strong will brought steadily to bear on any intention. If the effort fails, it is only because the will has hesitated. What have you made of some of your past lives, you and your lover both, through hesitation at a supreme moment? I looked at him appealingly. If we made mistakes, could we altogether help it? I asked. Does it not seem that we tried for the best? He smiled slightly. No, it does not seem so to me, he replied. The mainspring of your various previous existences, the law of attraction drawing you together, was, and is, love. This you fought against as though it were a crime, and in many cases you obeyed the temporary conventionalities of man rather than the unchanging ordinance of God. And now, divided as you have been, lost as you have been in endless whirlpools of infinitude, you are brought together again. And though your lover has ceased to question, you have not ceased to doubt. I do not doubt, I exclaimed suddenly and with passion. I love him with all my soul. I will never lose him again. Aselzion looked at me questioningly. How do you know you have not lost him already? He said. At this, a sudden wave of despair swept over me, a chill sense of emptiness and desolation. Could it be possible that my own rashness and selfishness had again separated me from my beloved? For so I now called him in my heart. Had I, by some foolish, distrustful thought, estranged him once more from my soul? The rising tears choked me. I rose from my seat, hardly knowing what I did, and went to the window for air. Aselzion followed me and laid his hand gently on my shoulder. It is not so difficult to win love as to keep it, he said. Misunderstanding and want of quick sympathy end in heartbreak and separation, and this is far worse than what mortals call death. The burning tears fell slowly from my eyes. Every word seemed to pierce my heart. I looked yearningly out on the sea, rippling under the moon. I thought of the day, barely a week ago, when Raphael stood beside me, his hand clasping mine. Such a little division of time seemed to have elapsed since we were together, and yet how long? At last I spoke. I would rather die, if death were possible, than lose his love, I said. And where there is no love, surely there must be death. Aselzion sighed. Poor child, now you understand why the lonely soul hurls itself wildly from one phase of existence to another till it finds its true mate, he answered. You say truly that where there is no love, there is no real life. It is merely a semi-conscious existence. But you have no cause to grieve, not now, not if you are firm and faithful. Raphael Santoris is safe and well, and his soul is so much with you. You are so constantly in his thoughts, that it is as if he were himself here. See!" And he placed his 2 hands for a moment over my eyes and then removed them. I uttered a cry of ecstasy, for there before me on the moonlit water I saw the dream, her sails glittering with light, and her aerial shape clearly defined against the sky. Oh, how I longed to fly across the strip of water which alone seemed to divide us, and once more to stand on the deck beside him, whom I now loved more than my very hopes of heaven. but I knew it was only a vision, conjured up before me by the magic of Aselzion, a magic used gently for my sake, to help and comfort me in a moment of sadness and heart's longing. And I watched, knowing that the picture must fade, as it slowly did, vanishing like a rainbow in a swirl of cloud. "It is indeed a dream," I said, smiling faintly, as I turned again to Aselzion. "I pray that love itself may never be so fleeting." "If love is fleeting, it is not love," he answered. "An ephemeral passion called by that name is the ordinary sort of attraction existing between ordinary men and women. Men who see no farther than the gratification of a desire, and women who see no higher than the yielding to that desire. Men who love in the highest and most faithful meaning of the term are much rarer than women. Women are very near the divine in love when it is first awakened in them. If afterwards they sink to a lower level, it is generally the men who have dragged them down. Unless a man is bent on the highest, he is apt to settle on the lowest, whereas a woman generally soars to the highest ideals at first in the blind instinct of a soul seeking its mate. How often she is hurled back from the empyrean only the angels know. Not to all is given power to master and control the life forces, and it is this I would have you understand before I leave you tonight. I can teach you the way to hold your life safely above all disintegrating elements, but the learning of the lesson rests with yourself." He sat down, and I resumed my place in the chair opposite to him, prepared to hear him with the closest attention. There were a few things on the table which I had not previously noticed, and one of these was a circular object covered with a cloth. He removed this covering and showed me a crystal globe which appeared to be full of some strange, volatile fluid, clear in itself, but intersected with endless floating, brilliant dots and lines. "Look well at this," he said, "for here you have a very simple manifestation of a great truth. These dots and lines, which you observe perpetually in motion, are an epitome of what is going on in the composition of every human being. Some of them, as you see, go in different directions, yet meet and mingle with each other at various points of convergence, then again become separated. They are the building up and the disintegrating forces of the whole cosmos, and, mark this well, they are all, when unimprisoned, directed by a governing will-power. You, in your present state of existence, are simply an organized form composed of these atoms, and your will-power, which is part of the divine creative influence, is set within you to govern them. If you govern them properly, the building up and revivifying atoms within you obey your command, and with increasing strength gradually control and subdue their disintegrating opponents which, after all, are only their servants, ready to disencumber them from all that is worthless and useless at the first sign of disablement. There is nothing more simple than this law, which has only to be followed in order to preserve both life and youth. It is all contained in an effort of the will, to which everything in nature responds, just as a well-steered ship obeys the compass. Remember this well, I say, everything in nature. This crystal globe holds momentarily imprisoned atoms which cannot just now be directed because they are shut in, away from all will to govern them. But if I left them as they are for a few more hours, their force would shatter the crystal, and they would escape to resume their appointed way. They are only shown to you as an object lesson to prove that such things are. They are facts, not dreams. You, like this crystal globe, are full of imprisoned atoms, atoms of spirit and matter, which work together to make you what you are. But you have also the governing will which is meant to control them and move them either to support, sustain, and revivify you, or else to weaken, break down, and finally disperse and disintegrate you, preparatory to your assumption of another form and phase of existence. Now, do you begin to understand? "I think I do," I answered, "but is it possible always to make this effort of will?" There is no moment in which you do not, consciously or subconsciously, will something, he answered. And the amount of power you use up in willing, perfectly trifling and ephemeral things could almost lift a planet. But let us take simple actions, such as raising a hand. You think this movement instinctive or mechanical, but it is only because you will to raise it that you can do it. If you willed not to raise it, it could not raise itself of itself. This tremendous force, this divine gift of willpower, is hardly exercised at all by the majority of men and women. Hence their manner of drifting here and there, their pliable yielding to this or that opinion, the easy sway obtained over the million by a few leaders and reformers, the infectious follies which possess whole communities at a time, the caprices of fashion, the moods of society. All these are due to scattered willpower, which if concentrated would indeed replenish the earth and subdue it. But we cannot teach the world, and therefore we must be content to teach and train a few individuals only. And when you ask if it is possible always to make the necessary effort of will, I answer yes. Of course it is possible. The secret of it all is to resolve upon a firm attitude and maintain it. If you encourage thoughts of fear, hesitation, disease, trouble, decay, incompetency, failure, and feebleness, you at once give an impetus to the disintegrating forces within you to begin their work, and you gradually become ill, timorous, and diseased in mind and body. If, on the contrary, your thoughts are centered on health, vitality, youth, joy, love, and creativeness, you encourage all the revivifying elements of your system to build up new nerve tissue and fresh brain cells, as well as to make new blood. No scientist has ever really discovered any logical cause why human beings should die. They are apparently intended to live for an indefinite period. It is they themselves who kill themselves. Even so-called accidents are usually the result of their own carelessness, recklessness, or inattention to warning circumstance. I am trying to put all this as simply as I can to you. There are hundreds of books which you might study, in which the very manner of expression is so abstruse and involved that even the most cultured intelligence can scarcely grasp it. But what I have told you is perfectly easy of comprehension. The only difficulty lies in its practical application. Tonight, therefore, and for the remainder of the time you are here, you will enter upon certain tests and trials of your will force, and the result of these will prove whether you are strong enough to be successful in your quest of life and youth and love. If you are capable of maintaining the true attitude, if you can find and keep the real center poise of the divine image within you, all will be well. And remember that if you once learn how to govern and control the atomic forces within yourself, you will equally govern and control all atomic forces which come within your atmosphere. This gives you what would be called by the ignorant miraculous power, though it is no miracle. It is nothing more than the attitude of spirit controlling matter. You will find yourself not only able to govern your own forces, but also to draw upon nature for fresh supplies. The air, the sunshine, the trees, the flowers will give you all they have to give on demand, and nothing shall be refused to you. Ask, and ye shall receive. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. Naturally, the law is that what you receive you must give out again in an ungrudging outflow of love and generosity and beneficence and sympathy, not only towards mankind but to everything that lives. For as you are told, give, and it shall be given unto you, good measure, pressed down and shaken together and running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that ye mete withal, it shall be measured to you again. These sayings of our greatest master are heard so often that they are considered by many people almost trite and commonplace, but they hold a truth from which we cannot escape. Even such a little matter as a kind word is paid back to the one who uttered it with a double interest of kindness. while a cruel or coarse one carries its own punishment. Those who take without giving are generally unsuccessful in their lives and aims, while those who give without taking appear to be miraculously served by both fame and fortune, this being merely the enactment of the spiritual law. "I do not want fame or fortune," I said. "Love is enough for me." Aselzion smiled. "Enough for you, indeed, my child! It is enough for all! If you have love, you have entered into the secret mind of God. Love inspires all nobleness, all endurance, all courage, and I think you have some of its attributes, for you have been bold in your first independent essay, and it is this very boldness that has brought me here to speak to you tonight. You have, of your own accord, and without preparation, passed what we students and mystics call the first circle of fire, and you are therefore ready for the rest of your trial. So, I will now take you back to your own room and leave you there, for you must face your ordeal alone." My heart sank a little, but I said nothing, and watched him as he took up the crystal globe, full of the darting lines and points of light gleaming like imprisoned fire, and held it for a moment between his two hands. Then he set it down again, and covered it as it had been covered before. The next moment he had extinguished the lamp, and we stood together in the pale brilliancy of the moonlight, which now spread itself in a broad path of silver across the sea. The tide was coming in, and I heard the solemn sound of rising waves breaking rhythmically upon the shore. In silence, Aselzion took me by the hand, and led me through a low doorway out of the little hermitage into the open air, where we stood within a few feet of the sea. The moonbeams bathed us in a shower of pearly radiance, and I turned instinctively to look at my companion. His face appeared transfigured into something of supernatural beauty, and for 1 second the remembrance of how he had said in the chapel that he carried the burden of 70 years upon him flashed across me with a shock of surprise. 70 years! He appeared to be in the very prime and splendour of life, and the mere idea of age as connected with him was absurd and incongruous. And while I gazed upon him, wondering and fascinated, he lifted one hand as though in solemn invocation to the stars that gleamed in their countless millions overhead, and his voice, deep and musical, rang out softly yet clearly on the silence. "O Supreme Guide of all the worlds created, accept this soul which seeks to be consecrated unto Thee. Help her to attain to all that shall be for her wisdom and betterment, and make her one with that nature whereof she is born. Thou, silent and peaceful night, invest her with thy deep tranquillity. Thou, bright moon, penetrate her spirit with the shining in of holy dreams. Give her of thy strength and depth, O sea, and may she draw from the treasures of the air all health, all beauty, all life, all sweetness, so that her existence may be a joy to the world, and her love a benediction. Amen." My whole being thrilled with a sense of keen rapture as he thus prayed for me. I could have knelt to him in reverence, but that I instinctively knew he would not wish this act of homage. I felt that it was best to keep silence, and I obeyed his guiding touch, as still holding my hand, he led me into a vaulted stone passage, and up a long winding stair, at the head of which he paused, and taking a key from his girdle, unlocked a small door. "There is your room, my child," he said, with a grave kindliness which moved me strangely. "Farewell, the future is with yourself alone." I clung to his hand for an instant. "Shall I not see you again?" I asked, with a little tremor in my voice. "Yes, you will see me again if you pass your ordeal successfully," he answered. "Not if you fail." "What will happen if I fail?" "Nothing but the most ordinary circumstance," he answered. "You will leave this place in perfect safety and return to your home and your usual avocations. You will live as most women live, perhaps on a slightly higher grade of thought and action, and in time you will come to look upon your visit to the house of Aselzion as the merest wilful escapade of folly. The world and its conventions will hold you. "Never!" I exclaimed passionately. "Aselzion, I will not fail!" He looked earnestly in my face, then laid his hands on my head in a mute blessing, and signed to me to pass into my turret room. I obeyed. He closed the door upon me instantly. I heard the key turn in the lock, and then just the faint echo of his retreating footsteps down the winding stair. My room was illumined by a very faint light, the source of which I knew not. Everything was as I had left it before I had been summoned to the mysterious chapel of the Cross and Star, and I looked about me, tranquilized by the peace and simplicity of my surroundings. I did not feel disposed to sleep, and I resolved to write down from memory all that Aselzion had told me while it was fresh in my mind. The white veil I had been given still clung about me. I now took it off and carefully folded it ready for further use if needed. Sitting down at the little table, I took out pen, ink, and paper, but somehow I could not fix my attention on what I intended to do. The silence around me was more intense than ever, and though my window was open, I could not even hear the murmur of the sea. I listened, hardly drawing breath. There was not a sound. The extraordinary silence deepened, and with it came a sense of cold. I seemed to be removed into a place apart, where no human touch, no human voice could reach me, and I felt as I had never felt. Chapter 16 of the Life Everlasting by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Statler. Shadow and Sound. The stillness deepened. It seemed to myself that I could hear the quickened beating of every pulse in my body. A curious vague terror began to possess me. I fought against its insidious influence, and bending my head down over the paper I had set out before me, I prepared to write. After a few minutes, I managed to gain some control over my nerves, and started to put down clearly and in sequence the things Aselzion had told me, though I knew there was little danger of my ever forgetting them. And then a sudden sensation came over me, which forced me to realize that something or someone was in the room, looking steadfastly at me. With an effort I raised my head, and saw nothing at first. Then, by degrees, I became aware that a shadow, dark and impenetrable, stood between me and the open window. At first it seemed simply a formless mass of black vapor, but very gradually it assumed the outline of a shape which did not seem human. I laid down my pen, and with my heart thumping hammer strokes of fear, looked at this strange darkness gathered as it were in one place, and blocking out the silver gleam of the moon. As I looked, all the light in my room was suddenly extinguished. A cry rose involuntarily to my lips, and physical fright began to gain the mastery over me. For with the increasing gloom, the mysterious shadow grew more and more defined, a blackness standing out, as it were, against another blackness, the pale glint of the moonbeams only illumining it faintly as a cloud may be edged with a suggestion of light. It was not motionless. It stirred now and then as though about to lift itself to some supernatural stature and bend above me or swoop down upon me like an embodied storm. And as I still gazed upon it fearingly, every nerve strained to an almost unsupportable tension, I could have sworn that two eyes, large and luminous, were fixed with a searching, pitiless intensity on mine. It is impossible to describe what I felt. A sense of sick, swooning horror overcame me. My head swam giddily, and I could not now utter a sound. Trembling violently, I rose to my feet in a kind of mechanical impulse, determined to turn away from the dreadful contemplation of this formless phantom, when suddenly as if by a lightning flash of conviction, the thought came to me that it was not by coward avoidance that I could expect to overcome either my own fears or the nameless danger which apparently threatened me. I closed my eyes and retreated, as it were, within myself, to find that centre poise of my own spirit, which I knew must remain an invincible force despite all attack, being in itself immortal. And I mentally barricaded my soul with thoughts of armed resistance. Then, opening my eyes again, I saw that the shadow loomed blacker and vaster, while the luminance around it was more defined, and was not the radiance of the moon, but some other light that was ghostly and terrifying. But I had now regained a little courage, and slight as it was, I held to it as my last hope, and gradually steadied myself upon it like a drowning creature clinging to a plank for rescue. Presently I found myself able to ask questions of my inner consciousness. What, after all, could this phantom, if phantom it were, do to work me harm? Could it kill me with sheer terror? Surely in that case the terror would be my own fault, for why should I be afraid? The thing called death being no more than a living change, did it matter so much when or how the change was effected? Who is responsible, I said to myself, for the sense of fear? Who is it that so mistrusts the divine order of the universe as to doubt the ultimate intention of goodness in things which appear evil? Is it not I alone who am the instigator of my own dread? And can this dark, dumb spectre do more to me than is ordained for my blessing in the end? With these thoughts I grew bold, my nervous trembling ceased. I now chose deliberately to consider, and willed to determine that this mysterious shadow, darker still as it grew, was something of a friend in disguise. I lifted my head half defiantly, half hopefully in the gloom, and the strange fact that the only light I saw came from the weirdly gleaming edge of radiance round the phantom itself did not frighten me from the attitude I had resolved upon. The more I settled myself into that attitude, the firmer it became, and the stronger grew my courage. I gently moved aside the table on which I had been writing, and stood up. Once on my feet, I felt still bolder and surer of myself, and though the shadow opposite to me looked darker and more threatening than before, I began to move steadily towards it. I made an effort to speak to it, and at last found my voice. "Whatever you are," I said aloud, "you cannot exist at all without God's will. God ordains nothing that is not for good. Therefore you cannot be here with any evil purpose. If I am afraid of you, my fear is my own weakness. I will not look at you as a thing that could or would do me harm, and therefore I am coming to you to find out your meaning. You shall prove to me what you are made of, to the very depth and heart of your darkness. You shall unveil to me all that you hide behind your terrifying aspect, because I know that whatever your intention towards me may be, you cannot hurt my soul." As I spoke, I drew nearer and nearer, and the luminous edge round the phantom grew lighter and lighter, till suddenly a flash of brilliant colour like a rainbow glittered full on my eyes so sharply that I fell back, half blinded by its splendour. Then, as I looked, I dropped to my knees in speechless awe, for the shadow had changed to a dazzling shape of winged radiance, a figure and face so glorious that I could only gaze and gaze, with all my soul entranced in wonder. I heard delicious music around me, but I could not listen. All my soul was in my eyes. The vision grew in stature and in splendour, and I stretched out my hands to it in prayerful appeal, conscious that I was in the shining presence of some inhabitant of higher and more heavenly spheres than ours. The beautiful head, crowned with a diadem of flowers like white stars, bent towards me. The luminous eyes smiled into mine, and a voice sweeter than all sweet singing spoke to me in accents of thrilling tenderness. "Thou hast done well," it said. "Even so, always approach darkness without fear. then shalt thou find the light. Meet sorrow with a trusting heart, so shalt thou discover an angel in disguise. God thinks no evil of thee, desires no wrong towards thee, has no punishment in store for thee. Give thyself into his hand, and be at peace. Slowly, like the colors of the sunset melting away into the gray of twilight, the vision faded, and when I recovered from the dazzled bewilderment into which I had been thrown, I found myself again in complete solitude and darkness, darkness unrelieved save by the dim light of the setting moon. I was for a long time unable to think of anything but the strange experience through which I had just passed, and I wondered what would have happened if, instead of boldly advancing and confronting the dark phantom which had so terrified me, I had striven to escape from it. I believed, and I think I was right in my belief, that I should have found every door open and every facility offered for a cowardly retreat had I chosen to make it. And then everything would have been at an end. I should have probably had to leave the house of Aselzion, and perhaps I too should have been marked with a black cross as a failure. Inwardly I rejoiced that so far I had not given way, and presently yielding to a drowsiness that began to steal over me, I undressed and went to bed, perfectly tranquil in mind and happy. I must have slept several hours when I was awakened suddenly by the sound of voices conversing quite close to me. In fact, they seemed to be on the other side of the wall against which my bed was placed. They were men's voices, and one or two were curiously harsh and irritable in tone. There was plenty of light in my room, for the night had passed, and as far as I could tell, it seemed to be early morning. The voices went on, and I found myself compelled to listen. "Aselzion is the cleverest humbug of his time," said one. "He is never so happy as when he can play the little god and dupe his worshippers." A laugh followed this sentence. "He's a marvel in his way," said another. "He must be a kind of descendant of some ancient Egyptian conjurer who had the trick of playing with fire. There is nothing in the line of so-called miracle he cannot do. And of course those who are ignorant of his methods, and who are credulous themselves—" "Like the woman here?" interposed the first voice. "Yes, like the woman here, little fool!" And there was more laughter. "Fancying herself in love with Raphael Santoris." I sat up in bed, straining my ears now for every word. My cheeks were burning, my heart beating. I hardly knew what to think. There was silence for 2 or 3 minutes. Minutes that seemed like ages in my longing to hear more. "Santoris always managed to amuse himself," said a thin, sharp voice with a mocking ring in its tone. "There was always some woman or other in love with him, some woman he could take in easily, of course." "Not difficult to find," rejoined the first voice that had spoken. "Most women are blind where their affections are concerned. Or their vanity." Another silence. I rose from my bed, shivering with a sense of sudden cold, and threw on my dressing-gown. Going to the window, I looked out on the fair expanse of the calm sea, silver-grey in the early dawn. How still and peaceful it looked! What a contrast to the storm of doubt and terror that was beginning to rage within my own heart! Hush! The voices began again. "Well, it's all over now, and his theory of perpetuating life at pleasure has come to an untimely end. Where did the yacht go down?" "Off Armadale, in Skye." For a moment I could not realize what had been said, and tried to repeat both the question and answer. Where did the yacht go down? Off Armadale, in Skye? What did it mean? The yacht gone down? What yacht? They were talking of Santoris, of Raphael, my beloved, my lover, lost through ages of time and space, and found again only to be once more separated from me through my own fault. My own fault? That was the horror of it, a horror I could not contemplate without an almost maddening anguish. I ran to the wall through which I had heard the voices talking, and pressed my ear against it, murmuring to myself, "Oh no, it is not possible, not possible! God would not be so cruel!" For many minutes I heard nothing, and I was rapidly losing patience and self-control, when at last I heard the conversation resumed. "He should never have risked his life in such a vessel," said one of the voices in a somewhat gentler tone. "It was a wonderfully clever contrivance, but the danger of all that electricity was obvious. In a storm it would have no chance." "That has been thoroughly proved," answered another voice. "Just half a gale of wind with a dash of thunder and lightning, and down it went, with every soul on board." "Santoris might have saved himself. He was a fine swimmer." "Was he?" Another silence. I thought my head would have burst with its aching agony of suspense. My eyes were burning like hot coals with a weight of unshed tears. I felt that I could have battered down the wall between me and those torturing voices in my feverish desire to know the worst at all costs. If Rafel were dead? But no, he could not die. He could not actually perish. But he could be parted from me as he had been parted before, and I should be alone again, alone as I had been all my life. And in my foolish pride I had voluntarily severed myself from him. Was this my punishment? More talking began, and I listened, like a criminal listening to a cruel sentence. "Aselzion will tell her, of course. Rather a difficult business, as he will have to admit that his teachings are not infallible, and on the whole there was something very taking about Santoris. I'm sorry he's gone, but he would only have fooled the woman had he lived." "Oh, that naturally. But that hardly matters. She would only have had herself to blame for falling into the trap." I drew myself away from the wall, trembling and sick with dread. Mechanically I dressed myself, and stared out at the gold of the sun which was now pouring its radiance full on the sea. The beauty of the scene moved me not at all. Nothing mattered. All that my consciousness could take in was that, according to what I had heard, Rafel was dead, drowned in the sea over which his fairy vessel the Dream had sailed so lightly, and that all he had said of our knowledge of each other in former lives, and of the love which had drawn us together, was mere fooling. I leaned out of the window, and my eyes rested on the little crimson rose that still blossomed against the wall in fragrant confidence. And then I spoke aloud, hardly conscious of my own words. "It is wicked," I said, "wicked of God to allow us to imagine beautiful things that have no existence. It is cruel to ordain us to love if love must end in disappointment and treachery. It would be better to teach us at once that life is intended to be hard and plain and without tenderness or truth, than to lead our souls into a fool's paradise." Then, all at once, I remembered the dark phantom of the night and its transformation into the vision of an angel. I had struggled against the terror of its first spectral appearance, and had conquered my fears. Why was I now shaken from my self-control? What was the cause? Voices merely. Voices behind a wall that spoke of death and falsehood. Voices belonging to persons I did not know and could not see, like the voices of the world which delight in uttering scandals and cruelties, and which never praise so much as they condemn. Voices merely. Ah, but they spoke of the death of him whom I loved. Must I not listen? They spoke of his treachery and fooling. Should I not hear? And yet, who were those persons, if persons they were, who talked of him with such easy callousness? I had met no one in the house of Aselzion save Aselzion himself and his servant or secretary, Honorius. Who then could there be except those two to know the reasons that had brought me hither? I began to question myself, and to doubt the accuracy of the terrible news I had inadvertently overheard. If any evil had chanced to Rafel Santoris, would Aselzion have told me he was safe and well when he had conjured up for my comfort the picture of the dream yacht on the moonlit sea only a few hours ago? Yet, with my bravest effort, I could not recover myself sufficiently to be quite at peace. And in my restless condition of mind I looked towards the turret door opening to the stairway which led to the little garden below and the seashore, but it was fast shut, and I remembered Aselzion had locked it. but to my complete surprise another door stood open, a door that had seemed part of the wall, and a small room was disclosed beyond it, a kind of little shrine, hung with pale purple silk, and looking as though it were intended to hold something infinitely precious. I entered it hesitatingly, not sure whether I was doing right or wrong, and yet impelled by something more than curiosity. As I stepped across the threshold, I heard the voices behind the wall again. They sounded louder and more threatening, and I paused, half afraid, yet longing to know all that might yet be said, though such knowledge might mean nothing but misery and despair to me. "All women are fools," and this trite observation was made by someone speaking in harsh and bitter accents. "It is not love that really moves them so much as the self-satisfaction of being loved. No woman could be faithful for long to a dead man. She would lack the expected response to her superabundant sentimentality, and she would tire of waiting to meet him in paradise, if she believed in such a possibility, which in 9 cases out of 10 she would not." "With Aselzion there are no dead men," said another of the unseen speakers. "They have merely passed into another living state, and according to his theories, lovers cannot be separated, even by what is called death, for long." "Poor comfort!" And with the words I heard a laugh of scornful mockery. "The women who have loved Raphael Santoris would hardly thank you for it." I shuddered a little as with cold. The women who had loved Raphael Santoris? This phrase seemed to darken the very recollection of the handsome face and form of the man I had, almost unconsciously to myself, begun to idealize. Something coarse and common suggested itself in association with him, and my heart sank within me, deprived of hope. Voices merely, yet how they tortured me! If I could only know the truth, I thought. If Aselzion would only come and tell me the worst at once! In a kind of stupor of unnameable grief, I stood in the little purple-hung shrine so suddenly opened to me, and began to dreamily consider the unkindness and harshness of those voices. Ah, so like the voices of the world, voices that sneer and mock and condemn, voices that would rather utter a falsehood than any word that should help and comfort, voices that take a cruel pleasure in saying just the one thing that will wound and crush an aspiring spirit, voices that cannot tune themselves to speak of love without grudging bitterness and scorn, voices, ah God, if only all the harsh and calumniating voices of humanity were stilled, what a heaven this earth would be! And yet, why should we listen to them? What have they really to do with us? Is the soul to be moved from its centre by casual opinion? What is it to me that this person or that person approves or disapproves my actions? Why should I be disturbed by rumours or frightened by ill report? Absorbed in these thoughts, I hardly realized the almost religious peace of my surroundings, and it was only when the voices ceased for a few minutes that I saw what was contained in this small room I had half unwittingly entered. An exquisite little table, apparently made of crystal which shone like a diamond, and on the table an open book. A chair was placed in position for the evident purpose of reading, and as I approached, at first indifferently and then with awakening interest, I saw that the open book showed an inscription on its flyleaf: "To a faithful student from Aselzion." Was I a faithful student? I asked myself the question doubtingly. There was no faithfulness in fears and depressions. Here was I, shaken in part from self-control, from the mere hearing of voices behind a wall. I, who had said that God ordains nothing that is not for good, was suddenly ready to believe that He had ordained the death of the lover to whom His laws had guided me. I, to whom had been vouchsafed the beatific vision of an angel who had said, "God thinks no evil of thee, desires no wrong towards thee, has no punishment in store for thee, give thyself into His hand and be at peace," was already flinching and turning away from the faith that should keep me strong. A sense of shame stole over me, and almost timidly I approached the table on which the open book lay, and sat down in the chair so invitingly placed. I had scarcely done this when the voices began again, in rather louder and angrier tones. "She imagines she can learn the secret of life! A woman, too! The brazen arrogance of such an attempt!" "No, no, it is not the secret of life she wants to discover, so much as the secret of perpetual youth. That to a woman is everything. To be always young and always fair. What feminine thing would not adventure for such merchandise?" A loud laugh followed this observation. "Santoris was well on his way to the goal," said a voice that was suave and calm of accent. "Certainly no one would have guessed his real age." "He had all the ardour and passion of youth," said another voice. "The fire of love ran as warmly in his veins as though he were a Romeo. None of the coldness and reluctance of age affected him where the fair sex was concerned." More laughter followed. I sat rigidly in the chair by the crystal table, listening to every word. "The woman here is the latest victim of his hypnotic suggestions, isn't she?" "Yes, one may say his last victim. He will victimize no more." "I suppose if Aselzion told her the truth, she would go at once." "Of course! Why should she remain? It is only a dream of love that has brought her here. When she knows the dream is over, there will be nothing left." "True, nothing left. The whole world a desert, and heaven itself without hope." I pressed my hands to my eyes to try and cool their burning ache. Was it possible that what these voices said could be true? They had ceased speaking, and there was a blessed silence. As a kind of desperate resource, I took out the letter Rafel Santoris had written to me, and read its every word with an eager passion of yearning, especially the one passage that ran thus: "We, you and I, who know that life, being all life, cannot die, ought to be wiser in our present space of time than to doubt each other's infinite capability for love and the perfect world of beauty which love creates." Wiser than to doubt! Ah, I was not wise enough. I was full of doubts and imagined evils. And why? Because of voices behind a wall. Surely a foolish cause for sorrow. I tried to extricate my mind from the darkness of despondency into which it had fallen, and to distract my attention from my own unhappy thoughts I glanced at the book which lay open before me. As I looked, its title, printed in letters of gold, flashed on my eyes like a gleam of the sun: "The Secret of Life." A sudden keen expectancy stirred in me. I folded Rafel's letter and slipped it back into its resting place near my heart. Then I drew my chair close up to the table and, bending over the book, began to read. All was now perfectly still around me. The voices had ceased. Gradually I became aware that what I was reading was intended for my instruction, and that the book itself was a gift to me from Aselzion if I proved a faithful student. A thrill of hope and gratitude began to relieve the cold weight upon my heart, and I suddenly resolved that I would not listen to any more voices, even if they spoke again. "Rafel Santoris is not dead," I said aloud and resolutely. "He could not so sever himself from me now. He is not treacherous, he is true. He is not fooling me. He is relying upon me to believe in him, and I will believe in him. My love and faith shall not be shaken by mere rumour. I will give him no cause to think me weak or cowardly. I will trust him to the end." And with these words spoken to the air, I went on reading quietly in a Chapter 17 of The Life Everlasting by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Statler. The Magic Book. It is not possible here to transcribe more than a few extracts from the book on which my attention now became completely riveted. The passages selected are chosen simply because they may by chance be useful to those very few, who desire to make of their lives something more than a mere buy and sell business, and also because they can hardly be called difficult to understand. When Paracelsus wrote The Secret of Long Life, he did so in a fashion sufficiently abstruse and complex to scare away all but the most diligent and persevering of students, this no doubt being his intention. But the instructions given in the volume placed, as I imagined, for my perusal, were simple, and in accordance with many of the facts discovered by modern science, and as I read on and on, I began to see light through the darkness, and to gain a perception of the way in which I might become an adept in what the world deems miracle, but which after all is nothing but the scientific application of common sense. To begin with, I will quote the following, headed Life and its Adjustment. Life is the divine impetus of love. The force behind the universe is love, and from that love is bred desire and creation. Even as the human lover passionately craves possession of his beloved, so that from their mutual tenderness the children of love are born, the divine spirit, immortally creative and desirous of perfect beauty, possesses space with eternal energy, producing millions of solar systems, each one of which has a different organization and a separate individuality. Man, the creature of our small planet the Earth, is but a single result of the resistless output of divine fecundity. Nevertheless, man is the image of God in that he is endowed with reason, will, and intelligence beyond that of the purely animal creation, and that he is given an immortal soul formed for love and for the eternal things which love creates. He can himself be divine in the desire and perpetuation of life. Considered in a strictly material sense, he is simply an embodied force composed of atoms held together in a certain organized form. But within this organized form is contained a spiritual being capable of guiding and controlling its earthly vehicle and adjusting it to surroundings and circumstances. In his dual nature, man has the power of holding his life cells under his own command. He can renew them or destroy them at pleasure. He generally elects to destroy them through selfishness and obstinacy, the two chief disintegrating elements of his mortal composition. Hence, the result which he calls death, but which is merely the necessary transposition of his existence, which he has himself brought about, into a more useful phase. If he were to learn once for all that he can prolong his life on this earth in youth and health for an indefinite period, in which days and years are not counted, but only psychic episodes or seasons, he could pass from one joy to another, from one triumph to another, as easy as breathing the air. It is judged good for a man's body that he should stand upright, and that he should move his limbs with grace and ease, performing physical exercises for the improvement and strengthening of his muscles, and he is not considered a fool for any feats of physical valor or ability which he may accomplish. Why then should he not train his soul to stand as upright as his body, so that it may take full possession of all the powers which natural and spiritual energy can provide? Reader and student, you for whom these words are written, learn and remember that the secret strength and renewal of life is adjustment, the adjustment of the atoms whereof the body is composed to the commands of the soul. Be the god of your own universe. Control your own solar system, that it may warm and revivify you with an ever-recurring spring. Make love the summer of your life, and let it create within you the passion of noble desire, the fervor of joy, the fire of idealism and faith. Know yourself as part of the divine spirit of all things, and be divine in your own creative existence. The whole universe is open to the searchings of your soul, if love be the torch to light your way. Having read thus far, I paused. The little room in which I sat appeared darker, or was it my fancy? I listened for the voices which had so confused and worried me, but there was no sound. I turned the pages of the book before me and found the following. The action of thought. Thought is an actual motive force, more powerful than any other motive force in the world. It is not the mere pulsation in a particular set of brain cells, destined to pass away into nothingness when the pulsation has ceased. Thought is the voice of the soul. Just as the human voice is transmitted through distance on the telephone wires, so is the soul's voice carried through the radiant fibers connected with the nerves to the brain. The brain receives it, but cannot keep it, for it again is transmitted by its own electric power to other brains, and you can no more keep a thought to yourself than you can hold a monopoly in the sunshine. Everywhere in all the worlds, throughout the whole cosmos, souls are speaking through the material medium of the brain. Souls that may not inhabit this world at all, but that may be as far away from us as the last star visible to the strongest telescope. The harmonies that suggest themselves to the musician here today may have fallen from Sirius or Jupiter, striking on his earthly brain with a spiritual sweetness from worlds unknown. The poet writes what he scarcely realizes, obeying the inspiration of his dreams. And we are all, at our best, but mediums for conveying thought, first receiving it from other spheres to ourselves, and then transmitting it from ourselves to others. Shakespeare, the chief poet and prophet of the world, has written, "There is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so," thus giving out a profound truth, one of the most profound truths of the psychic creed. For what we think, we are, and our thoughts resolve themselves into our actions. In the renewal of life and the preservation of youth, thought is the chief factor. If we think we are old, we age rapidly. If, on the contrary, we think we are young, we preserve our vitality indefinitely. The action of thought influences the living particles of which our bodies are composed, so that we positively age them or rejuvenate them by the attitude we assume. The thinking attitude of the human soul should be one of gratitude, love, and joy. There is no room in spiritual nature for fear, depression, sickness, or death. God intends His creation to be happy, and by bringing the soul and body both into tune with happiness, we obey His laws and fulfill His desire. Therefore, to live long, encourage thoughts of happiness. Avoid all persons who talk of disease, misery, and decay, for these things are the crimes of man, and are offenses against God's primal design of beauty. Drink in deep draughts of sunshine and fresh air. Inhale the perfume of flowers and trees. Keep far away from cities and from crowds. Seek no wealth that is not earned by hand or brain. And above all things, remember that the children of light may walk in the light without fear of darkness. Something in this latter sentence made me stop and look again around me, and again I felt sure that the room was growing darker, and not only darker but smaller. The purple silk hangings which draped the walls were almost within my touch, and I knew they had not been so close to me when I first sat down to read. A nervous tremor ran through me, but I resolved I would not be the dupe of my own fancy, and I set myself once more resolutely to the study of the volume before me. The next paragraph which attracted me was headed, "On the Command of Life's Forces," and began thus. To live long, you must have perfect control of the forces that engender life. The atoms of which your body is composed are in perpetual movement. Your spiritual self must guide them in the way they should go. Otherwise, they resemble an army without organization or equipment, easily put to rout by a first assault. If you have them under your spiritual orders, you are practically immune from all disease. Disease can never enter your system save through some unguarded corner. You may meet with accident, through the fault of others or through your own willfulness. If through your own willfulness, you have only yourself to blame. If through the fault of others, you may know that it was a destined and preordained removal of yourself from a sphere for which you are judged to be unfitted. Barring such accident, your life need know no end, even on this earth. Your spirit, called the soul, is a creature of light, and it can supply revivifying rays to every atom and cell in your body without stint or cessation. It is an exhaustless supply of radium from which the forces of your life may draw perpetual sustenance. Man uses every exterior means of self-preservation, but forgets the interior power he possesses, which was bestowed upon him that he might replenish the earth and subdue it. To replenish the earth is to give out love ungrudgingly to all nature. To subdue the earth is first to master the atoms of which the human organization is composed, and hold them completely under control, so that by means of this mastery all other atomic movements and forces upon this planet and its encircling atmosphere may be equally controlled. Much is talked of the light rays which pierce solid matter as though it were nothing but clear air, yet this discovery is but the beginning of wonders. There are rays which divine metals, even as the hazel wand divines the presence of water, and the treasures of the earth, the gold, the silver, the jewels, and precious things that are hidden beneath its surface and in the depths of the sea, can be seen in their darkest recesses by the penetrating flash of a ray as yet unknown to any but adepts in the psychic creed. No true adept is ever poor. Poverty cannot exist where perfect control of the life forces is maintained. Gladness, peace, and plenty must naturally attend the soul that is in tune with nature, and life is always perpetuated from the joy of life. Stand, therefore, O patient student, erect and firm. Let the radiating force of the soul possess every nerve and blood vessel of the body, and learn to command all things pertaining to good, with that strength which compels obedience. Not idly did the Supreme Master speak when he told his disciples that if their faith were but as a grain of mustard seed, they could command a mountain to be cast into the sea, and it would obey. Remember that the spirit within your bodily house of clay is divine, and of God, and that with God all things are possible. I raised my head from its bent position over the book and drew a long breath. Something oppressed me with a sense of suffocation, and looking up I saw that I was being steadily closed in, as by a contracting cage. The little room, draped with its soft purple hangings, was now too small for me to move about. I was pinned to my chair, and the ceiling was apparently descending upon me. With a shock of horrified memory, I recalled the old torture of the living tomb practiced by the Spanish Inquisition, when the wretched victim was compelled to watch the walls of his prison slowly narrowing round him inch by inch till he was crushed to death. How could I be sure that no such cruelties were used among the mysterious members of a mysterious brotherhood, whose avowed object of study was the searching out of the secret of life? I made an effort to rise, and found I could stand upright, and there, straight opposite to me, was the entrance to my own room, from which I had wandered into this small inner chamber. It seemed easy enough to get there, and yet I found myself hindered by an invisible barrier. I stood, with my heart beating nervously, wondering what was my threatening danger. Almost involuntarily my eyes still perused the printed page of the book before me, and I read the following sentences in a kind of waking dream. To the soul that will not study the needs of its immortal nature, life itself becomes a narrow cell. All God's creation waits upon it to supply what it shall demand, yet it starves in the midst of plenty. Fear, suspicion, distrust, anger, envy, and callousness paralyze its being and destroy its action. Love, courage, patience, sweetness, generosity, and sympathy are actual life forces to it, and to the body it inhabits. All the influences of the social world work against it. All the influences of the natural world work with it. There is nothing of pure nature that will not obey its behest, and this should be enough for its happy existence. Sorrow and despair result from the misguidance of the will. There is no other cause in earth or heaven for any pain or trouble. Misguidance of the will! I spoke the words aloud, then went on reading. What is heaven? A state of perfect happiness. What is happiness? The immortal union of two souls in one, creatures of God's eternal light, partaking each other's thoughts, bestowing upon each other the renewal of joy, and creating loveliness in form and action by their mutual sympathy and tenderness. Age cannot touch them. Death has no meaning for them. Life is their air and space and movement. Life palpitates through them and warms them with color and glory, as the sunshine warms and reddens the petals of the rose. They grow beyond mortality, and are immune from all disaster. They are a world in themselves, involuntarily creating other worlds as they pass from one phase to another of production and fruition. For there is no good work accomplished without love, no great triumph achieved without love, no fame, no victory gained without love. The lovers of God are the beloved of God. Their passion is divine, knowing no weariness, no satiety, no end. For God is the supreme lover, and there is nothing higher than love. Here, on a sudden impulse, I took up the book, closed it, and held it clasped in my two hands. As I did this, a great darkness overwhelmed me. A sound like thunder crashed on my ears, and I felt the whole room reeling into chaos. The floor sank, and I sank with it, down to a great depth, so swiftly that I had no time to think what had happened till the sensation of falling stopped abruptly, and I found myself in a narrow green lane, completely shadowed by the wide boughs of overarching trees. Hardly could I realize my surroundings when I saw Raphael Santoris himself, walking towards me, but not alone. The eager impulse to run to him was checked. I stood quiet and cold to the heart. A woman was with him, a woman young and very beautiful. His arm was round her, and his eyes looked with unwearied tenderness at her face. I heard his voice, caressing and infinitely gentle. "Beloved," he said, "I call you by this name as I have always called you through many cycles of time. Is it not strange that even the eager spirit, craving for its preordained mate, is subject to error? I thought I had found her whom I should love a little while before I met you, but this was a momentary blindness. You are the one I have sought for many centuries. You are the one and only beloved. Promise never to leave me again." She answered, and I heard her murmur, soft as a sigh, "I promise." Still walking together like lovers, they came on. I knew they must pass me, and I stood in their way that Raphael Santoris at least might see me, might know that I had adventured into the house of Aselzion for his sake, and that so far I had not failed. If he were false, then surely the failure would be his. With a sickening heart I watched him approach. His blue eyes rested on me carelessly with a cold smile. His fair companion glanced at me as at a stranger, and they moved on and passed out of sight. I could not have spoken had I tried. I was stricken dumb and feeble. This was the end, then? I had made my journey to no purpose? He had already found another subject for his influence? Stunned and bewildered with the confusion of thought in my brain, I tried to walk a few paces, and found the ground soft as velvet, while a cool breeze blowing through the trees refreshed my aching forehead and eyes. I still held the book, The Secret of Life, and in a dull, aimless way thought how useless it was. What does life matter if love be untrue? The sun was shining somewhere above me, for I saw glinting reflections of it through the close boughs, and there were birds singing, but both beauty of sight and beauty of sound were lost to me. I had no real consciousness left, save that the lover who professed to love me with an eternal love, loved me no more. So the world was desolate, and heaven itself a blank? Death, and death alone, seemed dear and desirable. I walked slowly and with difficulty. My limbs were languid, and I had lost all courage. If I could have found my way to Aselzion, I would have told him, "This is enough. No more do I need the secret of youth or life, since love has left me. Presently I began to think more coherently. A little while back I had heard voices behind a wall saying that Raphael Santoris was dead, drowned in his own yacht, off Armadale in Skye. If that was true, how came he here? I questioned myself in vain, till presently I gathered up sufficient force to remember that love, real love, knows no change. Did I believe in my lover's love, or did I doubt it? That was a point for my own consideration. But had I not the testimony of my own eyes? Was I not myself the witness of his altered mind? Here, seeing a rustic seat under one of the shadiest trees, I sat down, and my mind gradually steadied itself. Why, I inwardly asked, had I been so suddenly and forcibly brought into this place for no apparent reason, save to look upon Raphael Santoris in the company of another woman whom it seemed that he now preferred to me? Ought that to make any difference in my love for him? In love, if love be love, if love be ours, faith and unfaith can ne'er be equal powers. Unfaith in aught is want of faith in all. If the happiness of the one I loved was obtained through other means than mine, ought I to grudge it? And yet my heart was full of a sick heaviness. It seemed to me that I had lately been the possessor of an inestimable joy which had been ruthlessly snatched from me. Still meditating in solitary sadness, I sat in the soft gloom, wondering at the strange chance that had brought me into such a place, and curiously enough never thinking that the whole adventure might be the result of a preordained design. Presently, hearing slow footsteps approaching, I looked up and saw an aged man walking towards me, accompanied by a woman of gentle and matronly appearance, who supported him on her arm. The looks of both of these personages were kindly, and inspired confidence at a glance, and I watched them coming with a kind of hope that perhaps they might explain my present dilemma. I was particularly attracted by the venerable and benevolent aspect of the man, and as he drew near, seeing that he evidently intended to speak to me, I rose from my seat and made a step or two forward to meet him. He inclined his head courteously and smiled upon me with a grave and compassionate air. "I am very glad," he said in a friendly tone, "that we have not come too late. We feared, did we not?" Here he looked to his companion for confirmation of his words. "That you might have been hopelessly ensnared and victimized before we could come to the rescue." "Alas, yes," said the woman in accents of deep pity, "and that would have been terrible indeed." I stared at them both, utterly bewildered. They spoke of rescue? Rescue from what? Hopelessly ensnared and victimized? What did they mean? Since I had seen Raphael Santoris with another woman he called beloved, I had felt almost incapable of speech, but now I found my voice suddenly. "I do not understand you," I said as clearly and firmly as I could. "I am here by my own desire, and I am not being ensnared or victimized. Why should I need rescue?" The old man shook his head compassionately. "Poor child," he said, "are you not a prisoner in the house of Aselzion?" "With my own consent," I answered. He lifted his hands in a kind of appealing astonishment, and the woman smiled sadly. "Not so," she told me. "You are under a very serious delusion. You are here by the wicked will of Raphael Santoris, a man who would sacrifice any life remorselessly in the support of his own mad theories. You are under his influence, you poor creature, so easily trapped, too. You think you are following your own way and carrying out your own wishes, but you are really the slave of Santoris, and have been so ever since you met him. You are a mere instrument on which he can play any tune." And she turned to the old man beside her with an appealing gesture. "Is it not so?" He bent his head in the affirmative. For a moment my brain was in a whirl. Could it be possible that what they said was true? Their looks were sincere. They could have no object but kindness in warning me of intended mischief. I tried to conceal the torturing anxiety that possessed me, and asked quietly, "If you have good reason to think all this, what would you advise me to do? If I am in danger, how shall I escape from it?" The woman looked curiously at me, and her eyes glittered with sudden interest. Her venerable companion replied to my question. "Escape is quite easy here and now. You have only to follow us, and we will take you out of this wood and escort you to a place of safety. Then you can return to your own home and forget—" "Forget what?" I interrupted him. "All this foolishness," he answered with a gentle seriousness. "This idea of eternal life and love which the artful conjurer, Raphael Santoris, has instilled into your too sensitive and credulous imagination, these fantastic beliefs in the immortality and individuality of the soul, and you will accept old age and death with the sane resignation of ordinary mortals. Such love as he professes to believe in does not exist, such life can never be, and the secret of his youth—" "Ah!" I exclaimed eagerly, "tell me of that, and of Aselzion's splendid prime when he should be old and feeble. Tell me of that also." For the first time during this interview my two companions looked confused. I saw this, and I gained confidence from their evident embarrassment. "Why," I pursued, "should you come to me with warnings against those whom God or destiny has brought into my life? You may perhaps say that you yourselves have been sent by God, but does deity contradict itself? I am not conscious of having suffered any evil through Raphael Santoris or through Aselzion. I am pained and perplexed and tortured by what I hear and see, but my hearing and sight are capable of being deceived. Why should I think of evil things which are not proved?" The woman surveyed me with sudden scorn. "So you will stay here, the dupe of your own sentiments and dreams?" she said contemptuously. "You, a woman, will remain among a community of men who are known impostors, and sacrifice your name and reputation to a mere chimera?" Her look and manner had completely changed, and I was at once on my guard. "My name and reputation are my own to protect," I answered coldly. "Whatever I do, I shall be ready to answer for to anyone having the right to ask." The old man now advanced and laid his hand on my arm. His eyes sparkled angrily. "You must be saved from yourself," he said sharply. "You must come with us whether you will or no. We have seen too many victims of Aselzion's art already. We are resolved to save you from the peril which threatens you." And he made an effort to draw me closer to him, but my spirit was up and I held back with all my force. "No, I will not go with you!" I exclaimed hotly. "God alone shall remove me from harm, if any harm is really meant towards me. I do not believe one word you have said against Raphael Santoris or against Aselzion. I love the one and I trust the other. Let me go my own way in peace." Hardly had I spoken these words when both the old man and woman threw themselves upon me, and seizing me by force, endeavoured to drag me away with them. I resisted with all my strength, still holding tightly the book of the Secret of Life in one hand. But their united efforts were beginning to overpower me, and feeling myself growing weaker and weaker, I cried aloud in desperation, "Raphael! Raphael!" In an instant I stood free. My captors loosed their hold of me, and I rushed away, not knowing whither, only running, afraid of pursuit, till I suddenly found myself alone on the borders of a dark stretch of water. Chapter 18 of The Life Everlasting by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Statler. Dreams within a Dream. I stopped abruptly, brought perforce to a standstill. There was nothing but the black water heaving in front of me with a slow and dizzying motion, and faintly illumined by a dim pearly light like that of a waning moon. I looked behind me, fearing my persecutors were following, and saw that a thick mist filled the air and space to the obliteration of everything that might otherwise have been visible. I had thought it was day, and that the sun was shining, but now it appeared to be night. Utterly fatigued in body and mind, I sat down wearily on the ground, close to the edge of the strange dark flood, which I could scarcely see. The quiet and deep obscurity had a lulling effect on my senses, and I thought languidly how good it would be if I might be allowed to rest where I was for an indefinite time. "I can understand," I said to myself, "why many people long for death, and pray for it as a great blessing. They have lost love, and without love life is valueless. To live on and on through cycles of time in worlds that are empty of all sweetness, companionless and deprived of hope and comfort, this would be hell, not heaven." "Hell, not heaven," said a voice near me. I started and looked up. A shadowy figure stood beside me, that of a woman in dark trailing garments, whose face shone with a pale beauty in the dim light surrounding us both. "So you have found your way here at last," she said gently, "here where all things end and nothing begins." I rose to my feet and confronted her. "Where all things end?" I repeated. "Surely where life exists there is no end." She gave me a fleeting smile. "Life is a dream," she said, "and the things of life are dreams within the dream. There are no realities. You imagine truths which are deceptions." I looked at her in wonder and bewilderment. She was beautiful, and the calm sadness of her eyes expressed compassion and tenderness. "Then is creation a lie?" I asked. She made no immediate answer, but pointed with one hand towards the dark water. I looked and uttered a cry of ecstasy. There, shining in the heaving blackness like a vision from fairyland, was the dream, glittering from stem to stern with light that sparkled like millions of diamonds. "Your dream of love," said the woman beside me. "Behold it for the last time." With straining eyes and beating heart I watched, and saw the shining vessel begin to sink slowly into the deep watery blackness, down, down still lower, till only her masts were visible. Then something defiant and forceful sprang up within me. I would master this torture, I thought. I would not yield to the agony that threatened to drive me to utter despair. "This is a phantom of sorrow," I said. "It has no meaning. The love that is in my heart is my own. It is my life, my soul, my inmost being. It is eternal as God Himself, and to Him I commend it." I spoke these words aloud, holding the book of the Secret of Life clasped to my breast, and raised my eyes trustfully to the dense darkness which should have been the sky. Then I felt the woman's hand on mine. Her touch was warm and gentle. "Come," she said softly, and I saw a small boat slip out on the gloomy water, guided towards me by one whose face was hidden in a fold of black. My companion drew me with her and signed to me to enter. Something in myself, as well as in her looks, impelled me to obey, and as she stepped into the boat I followed. We were borne along in silence for what seemed to me a long time, till suddenly I began to hear strange sounds of wailing and shuddering cries of appeal, and our darkness was lightened by the drifting to and fro of pale forms that were luminous and human in shape, though scarcely of human resemblance. "What are these?" I whispered. My companion took my hand and held it. "Listen," she answered. And gradually, out of a clamour of weeping and complaint, I heard voices which uttered distinct things. "I am the phantom of wealth," said one. "For me, men and nations have rushed on destruction. For me, they have sacrificed happiness and missed the way to God. For me, innocence has been betrayed and honour murdered. I am but a shadow, but the world follows me as if I were light. I am but the gold dust of the earth, and men take me for the glory of heaven." "I am the phantom of fame," said another. "I come with music and sweet promises. I float before the eyes of man, seeming to him an angel. I speak of triumph and power, and for me brave hearts have broken, and bright spirits have been doomed to despair. I am but a shadow, but the world believes me substance. I am but a breath and a colour, but men take me for a fixed star." "I am the phantom of pride," said a third voice. "For me, humanity scales the height of ambition. For my sake, kings and queens occupy uneasy thrones and surround themselves with pomp and panoply. For me, men lie and cheat and wrong their neighbours. For me, the homes that should be happy are laid waste. For me, false laws are made and evil conquers good. I am but a shadow, and the world takes me for the sun. I am but a passing flash of light, and men take me for the perfect day." Other voices joined in and echoed wildly around me, and I rose up in the boat, loosing my hold from the clasp of the woman who was with me. "You are phantoms all!" I cried, half unconscious of my own words. "I want God's angels! Where is love?" The voices ceased. The strange flitting figures that wailed round me faded away into mist and disappeared, and a light, deep and golden and wonderful, began to shine through the gloom. My companion spoke. "We have been looking at dreams," she said. "You ask for the only real." I smiled. A sudden inrush of strength and authority possessed me. "You bade me look my last upon my dream of love," I said. "But you knew that was impossible, for love is no dream." The golden radiance widened into a perfect splendour, and our boat now glided over a shining sea. As in a vision, I saw the figure that steered and guided it change from darkness to brightness. The black fold fell from its face, angel eyes looked at me, angel lips smiled, and then I found myself suddenly alone on the shore of a little bay, blue as a sapphire in the reflection of the blue sky above it. The black stretch of water which had seemed so dreary and impassable had disappeared, and to my astonishment I recognized the very shore near the rock garden which was immediately under my turret room. I looked everywhere for the woman who had been in the boat with me, for the boat itself and its guide, but there was no trace of them. Where and how far I had wandered I could not imagine, but presently, regaining nerve and courage, I began to fancy that perhaps my strange experience had been preordained and planned as some test of my faith and fortitude. Had I failed? Surely not, for I had not doubted the truth of God or the power of love. There was only one thing which puzzled me, the memory of those voices behind a wall, the voices which had spoken of Raphael's death and treachery. I could not quite rid myself of the anxiety they had awakened in my mind, though I tried hard not to yield to the temptation of fear and suspicion. I knew and felt that, after all, it is the voices of the world which work most harm to love, and that neither poverty nor sorrow can cut the threads of affection between lovers so swiftly as falsehood and calumny. And yet I allowed myself to be moved by vague uneasiness on this account, and could not entirely regain perfect composure. The door of the winding stair leading to my room in the turret stood open, and I availed myself of this tacit permission to return thither. I found everything as I had left it, except that when I sought for the mysterious little room hung with purple silk, where I had begun to read the book called The Secret of Life, a book which, through all my strange adventure, I still had managed to keep with me, I could not find it. The walls around me were solid, there was no sign of an opening anywhere. I sat down by the window to think. There before my eyes was the sea, calm and in the full radiance of a brilliant sun. No mysterious or magic art suggested itself in the visible scene of a smiling summer day. Had I been long absent from this room, I wondered? I could not tell. Time seemed to be annihilated, and so far as I myself was concerned, I desired nothing in this world or the next save just to know if Raphael Santoris still lived, and, yes, one other assurance, to feel that I still possessed the treasure of his love. All the past, present and future hung on this possibility. There was nothing more to hope for or to attain. For if I had lost love, then God himself could give me no comfort, since the essential link with divine things was broken. Gradually a great and soothing quietude stole over me and the cloud of depression that had hung over my mind began to clear. I thought of my recent experience with the man and woman who had sought to rescue me, as they said, and how, when in sheer desperation I had called "Raphael! Raphael!" they had suddenly disappeared and left me free. Surely this was a sufficient proof that I was not forgotten by him who had professed to love me, and that his aid might still be depended upon? Why should I doubt him? I had placed my book, The Secret of Life, on the table when I re-entered my room, but now I took it up again, and the pages fell open at the following passage. When once you possess the inestimable treasure of love, remember that every effort will be made to snatch it from you. There is nothing the world envies so much as a happy soul. Those who have been your dearest friends will turn against you because you have a joy in which they do not share. They will unite with your foes to drag you down from your height of paradise. The powers of the coarse and commonplace will be arrayed against you. Shafts of disdain and ridicule will be hurled at your tenderest feelings. Venomous lies and cruel calumnies will be circulated around you, all to try and draw you from the circle of light into darkness and chaos. If you would stand firm, you must stand within the whirlwind. If you would maintain the centre poise of your soul, you must preserve the balance of movement. The radiant and deathless atoms whereof your body and spirit are composed must be under steady control and complete organization, like a well-disciplined army. Otherwise, the disintegrating forces set up by the malign influences of others around you will not only attack your happiness, but your health, break down your strength, and murder your peace. Love is the only glory of life, the heart and pulse of all things, a possession denied to earth's greatest conquerors, a talisman which opens all the secrets of nature, a divinity whose power is limitless and whose benediction bestows all beauty, all sweetness, all joy. Bear this in mind, and never forget how such a gift is grudged to those who have it by those who have it not. Reading thus far, a light began to break in upon me. Had not all the weird and inexplicable experience of the past hours or days tended to shake me from love and destroy my allegiance to the ideal I cherished? And had I yielded to the temptation? Had I failed? I dared not estimate either failure or success. Leaving my place at the window, I saw that the little lift or dresser in the wall had come up noiselessly with its usual daintily prepared refection of fruit and bread and deliciously cool spring water. I had felt neither hunger nor thirst during my strange wanderings in unknown places, but now I was quite ready for a meal, and enjoyed it with all the zest of an unspoilt appetite. When I had finished, I returned to my precious book, and placing it on the table, I propped up my head between my two hands and set myself resolutely to study. And I write down here the passages I read, exactly as I found them, for those who care to practice the lessons they teach. Free will. The exercise of the will is practically limitless. It is left unfettered so that we may be free to make our own choice of life and evolve our own destiny. It can command all things save love, for love is of God, and God is not subject to authority. Love must be born in the soul and of the soul. It must be a dual flame. That is to say, it must find its counterpart in another soul which is its ordained mate before it can fulfill its highest needs. Then, like two wings moved by the same soaring impulse, it assists the will and carries it to the highest heaven. Through its force, life is generated and preserved. Without it, life escapes to the other phases to find its love again. Nothing is perfect, nothing is lasting, without the light and fire of this dual flame. It cannot be willed either to kindle or to burn. It must be born of itself and in itself, and shed its glory on the souls of its own choice. All else is subject to order and command. Love alone is free. Power. Power over all things and all men is obtained by organization, that is to say, setting one's house in order. The house implied is the body in which the soul has temporary dwelling. Every corner of it must be in order, every atom working healthfully in its place without any suggestion of confusion. Then whatever is desired shall be attained. Nothing in the universe can resist the force of a steadfastly fixed resolve. What the spirit truly seeks must, by eternal law, be given to it, and what the body needs for the fulfillment of the spirit's commands will be bestowed. From the sunlight and the air and the hidden things of space, strength shall be daily and hourly renewed. Everything in nature shall aid in bringing to the resolved soul that which it demands. There is nothing within the circle of creation that can resist its influence. Success, wealth, triumph upon triumph come to every human being who daily sets his house in order, whom nothing can move from his fixed intent, whom no malice can shake, no derision drive from his determined goal, whom no temptation can drag from his appointed course, and who is proof against spite and calumny. For men's minds are for the most part like the shifting sands of the sea, and he alone rules who evolves order from chaos. Eternal life. Life is eternal because it cannot die. Everything that lives must live forever. Everything that lives has always lived. What is called death is by law impossible. Life is perpetually changing into various forms, and every change it makes we call death, because to us it seems a cessation of life, whereas it is simply renewed activity. Every soul imprisoned today in human form has lived in human form before. The very rose that flowers on its stem has flowered in this world before. Each individual spirit preserves its individuality and, to a certain extent, its memory. It is permitted to remember a few out of the million incidents and episodes with which its psychic brain is stored, but only a few during its period of evolvement. When it reaches the utmost height of spiritual capacity and is strong enough to know and see and understand, then it will remember all from the beginning. Nothing can ever be forgotten, inasmuch as forgetfulness implies waste, and there is no waste in the scheme of the universe. Every thought is kept for use, every word, every sigh and tear is recorded. Life itself, in our limited view of it, can be continued indefinitely on this earth if we use the means given to us to preserve and renew it. It was easy to preserve and prolong it in the early days of the world's prime, for our planet was then nearer to the sun. In the present day it is returning to a position in the heavens which encourages and sustains life, and men live longer without knowing why, never thinking that it is the result of the immediate situation of the planet with regard to the sun. The earth is not where it was in the days of Christ. It has been rushing through space these 2,000 years, and yet mankind forgets that its place in the heavens is different from that which it formerly occupied, and that with this difference the laws of climate, custom, and living are changed. It is not man who alters his surroundings, it is nature, whose order cannot be disobeyed. Man thinks that the growth of science and what he calls progress is the result of his own cleverness alone. On the contrary, it is the result of a change in his atmospheric ether which not only helps scientific explanation and discovery, but which tends to give him greater power over the elements, as well as to prolong his life and intellectual capability. There is no such thing as standing still in the universe. Every atom, every organism is doing something or going somewhere, and there is no stop. Rest itself is merely a form of progress towards beauty and perfection, and there is no flaw anywhere in the majestic splendor of God's scheme for the ultimate happiness of His entire creation. Arrogant asceticism. The ascetic is a blasphemer of God and of the work for which God alone is responsible. By withdrawing himself from the world of men, he withdraws himself from human sympathy. By chastising his body and its natural emotions and desires, He chastises that which God has made as a temple for his soul to dwell in. By denying the pleasures of the world, he denies all the good which God has prepared and provided for him, and he wrongs the fair happiness of nature and the order in which the universe is planned. The so-called religious person who retires into a monastery, there to pray and fast and bemoan the ills of the flesh, is an unnatural creature and displeasing to his Maker. For God looked upon everything he had made and found it good. Good, not bad, as the arrogant ascetic would assume. Joy, not sorrow, should be the keynote of life. The world is not a vale of tears, but a flower-filled garden, basking in the perpetual sunshine of the smile of God. What is called sin is the work of man. God has no part in it. By pride the angels fell. By pride man delays his eternal delight. When he presumes to be wiser than his Creator, when he endeavours to upset the organization of nature and invents a kind of natural and moral code of his own, then comes disaster. The rule of a pure and happy life is to take all that God sends with thankfulness in moderation, the fruits of the earth, the joys of the senses, the love of one's fellow creatures, the delights of the intellect, the raptures of the soul, and to find no fault with that which is and must ever be faultless. We hear of wise men and philosophers sorrowing over the pain and suffering of the world, but the pain and suffering are wrought by man alone, and man's cruelty to his fellows. From man's culpable neglect of the laws of health has come every disease, as from man's egotism, unbelief, and selfishness have sprung all the crimes in the calendar. I paused here, for it seemed to me that it was getting dark. At any rate, I could not see to read very clearly. I looked at the window, but very little light came through it. A sudden obscurity, like a heavy cloud, darkened all visible things. I quickly made up my mind that I would not yield to any more fanciful terrors, or leave the room, even if I saw another outlet that night. With this determination, I undressed quickly and went to bed. As I laid my head on the pillow, I felt a kind of coldness in the air, which made me shiver a little, an uncanny sensation to which I would not yield. I saw the darkness thickening round me and closed my eyes, resolving to rest, and so succeeded in ordering all my Chapter 19 of The Life Everlasting by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Statler. The Unknown Deep. My slumber was so profound and dreamless that I have no idea how long it lasted, but when finally I awoke, it was with a sense of the most vivid and appalling terror. Every nerve in my body seemed paralyzed. I could not move or cry out. Invisible bands stronger than iron held me a prisoner on my bed, and I could only stare upwards in horror, as a victim bound to the rack might stare at the pitiless face of his torturers. A figure, tall, massive, and clothed in black, stood beside me. I could not see its face, but I felt its eyes gazing down upon me with a remorseless, cold inquisitiveness, a silent, searching enquiry which answered itself without words. If every thought in my brain and every emotion of my soul could have been cut out of me with a dissecting knife and laid bare to the outward inspection, those terrible eyes, probing deep into the very innermost recesses of my being, would have done the work. The beating of my heart sounded loud and insistent in my own ears. I lay still, trying to gain control over my trembling spirit, and it was almost with an awful sense of relief that I saw the figure move at last from its rigid attitude and beckon slowly and commandingly with one outstretched arm from which the black, dank draperies hung like drifting cloud. Mechanically obeying the signal, I strove to rise from my bed, and found that I could do so. I sat up shiveringly, looking at the terrifying form that towered above me, enclosing me, as it were, in its own shadow. And then, managing to stand on my feet, though unsteadily, I mutely prepared to follow where it should lead. It moved on, and I went after it, compelled by some overpowering instinct against which I dared not rebel. Once the vague, half-formed thought flitted through my brain, "This is death that summons me away," till with the thought came the remembrance that, according to the schooling I was receiving, there is no such thing as death, but only the imaginary phantom we call by that name. Slowly, sedately, and with an indescribable majesty of movement, the dark figure glided on before me, and I, a trembling little creature, followed it, I knew not whither. There was no obstacle in our course. Doors, walls and windows seemed to melt asunder into nothingness as we passed, and there was no stop to our onward progress, till suddenly I saw before me a steep and narrow spiral stairway of stone winding up into the very centre of a rocky pinnacle, which in its turn lifted its topmost peak into the darkness of a night sky sprinkled with millions of stars. The sombre figure paused, and again I felt the searchlight of its invisible eyes burning through me. Then, as though satisfied with its brief survey, it began to ascend the spiral stair. I followed step by step. The way was long and difficult, the sharp turns dizzying to the senses, and there seemed no end to the upward winding. Sometimes I stumbled and nearly fell. Sometimes I groped on hands and knees, always seeing before me the black-draped form that moved on with such apparently little care as to whether or no I fared ill or well in my obedience to its summons. And now, as I climbed, all sorts of strange memories began to creep into the crannies of my brain and perplex me with trouble and uncertainty. Chiefly did my mind dwell on cruelties, the cruelties practised by human beings to one another, moral cruelties especially, they being so much worse than any physical torture. I thought of the world's wicked misjudgments passed on those who are greater in spirit than itself, how, even when we endeavour to do good to others, our kindest actions are often represented as merely so many forms of self-interest and self-seeking, how our supposed best friends often wrong us and listen credulously to enviously invented tales against us, how even in love, love, that most ethereal yet most powerful of passions, a rough word, an unmerited slight, may separate for a lifetime those whose love would otherwise have been perfect. And still I climbed, and still I thought, and still the dark phantom figure beckoned me on and on. And then I began to consider that in climbing to some unknown, unseen height in deep darkness, I was, after all, doing a wiser thing than living in the world with the ways of the world, ways that are for the most part purely hypocritical, and are practised merely to overreach and outdo one's fellow men and women, ways of fashion, ways of society, ways of government which are merely temporary, while nature, the invincible and eternal, moves on her appointed course with the same inborn intention, namely, to destroy that which is evil and preserve only that which is good. And man, the sole maker of evil, the only opposer of divine order, fools himself into the belief that his evil shall prosper and his falsehood be accepted as truth if he can only sham a sufficient show of religious faith to deceive himself and others on the ascending plane of history. He who has invented sin has likewise invented a God to pardon it, for there is no sin in the natural universe. The divine law cannot pardon, for it is inviolate and bears no trespass without punishment. So I mused in my inward self, and still I climbed, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure that led me on, and which now, having reached the end of the spiral stair, was slowly mounting to the highest peak of the rocky pinnacle which lifted itself to the stars. An icy wind began to blow, my feet were bare, and I was thinly clad in my night gear with only the addition of a white woolen wrap I had hastily flung round me for warmth when I left my bed to follow my spectral leader, and I shivered through and through with the bitter cold. Yet I went on resolutely. Indeed, having started on this perilous adventure, there was no returning, for when I looked back on the way I had come, the spiral stair had completely vanished, and there was nothing but black and empty space. This discovery so terrified me that for the moment I lost breath, and I came to a halt in the very act of ascending. Then I saw the figure in front of me turn round with a threatening movement, and I felt that with 1 second more of hesitation I should lose my footing altogether and slip away into some vast abysmal depth of unimaginable doom. Making a strong effort, I caught back my escaping self-control and forced my shuddering limbs to obey my will and resume their work. And so, slowly, inch by inch, I resumed my climb, sick with giddiness and fear, and chilled to the very heart. Presently I heard a rumbling roar like the sound of great billows rushing into hollow caverns, which echoed their breaking in thuds of booming thunder. Looking up, I saw the figure I had followed standing still, and I fancied that the sombre draperies in which it was enveloped showed an outline of glimmering light. Fired by a sudden hope, I set myself to tread the difficult path anew, and presently I too stood still, beside my mysterious leader. Above me was a heaven of stars, below an unfathomable deep of darkness where nothing was visible. But from this nothingness arose a mighty turbulence as of an angry sea. I remained where I found myself, afraid to move. One false step might, I felt, hurl me into a destruction which, though it would not be actual death, would certainly be something like chaos. Almost I felt inclined to catch at the cloudy garments of the solemn figure at my side for safety and protection, and while this desire was yet upon me, it turned its veiled head towards me and spoke in a low, deep tone that was infinitely gentle. "So far, and yet not far enough," it said. "To what end wilt thou adventure for the sake of love?" "To no end whatsoever," I answered with sudden boldness, "but to everlasting continuance." Again I thought I saw a faint glowing light within its sombre draperies. "What wouldst thou do for love?" its voice again inquired. "Wouldst thou bear all things, and believe all things? Canst thou listen to falsehood bearing witness against truth, and yet love on? Wilt thou endure all suffering, all misunderstanding, all coldness and cruelty, and yet keep thy soul bright as a burning lamp with the flame of faith and endeavour? Wouldst thou scale the heavens and plunge to the uttermost hell for the sake of him thou lovest, knowing that thy love must make him one with thee at the God-appointed hour?" I looked up at the figure, vainly striving to see its face. "All these things I would do," I answered. "All that is in the power of my soul to endure, mortally or immortally, I will bear for love's sake." Again the light flashed through its black garments. When it next spoke, its voice rang out harshly in ominous warning. "Thy lover is dead," it proclaimed. "He has passed from this sphere to another, and ye shall not meet again for many cycles of time. Dost thou believe it?" A cold agony gripped my breast, but I would not yield to it, and answered resolutely, "No, I do not believe it. He could not die without my knowing and feeling the parting of his soul from mine." There was a pause in which only the thunder of that invisible sea far down below us was audible. Then the voice went on. "Thy lover is false," it said. "His love for thee was a passing mood. Already he regrets, already he wearies in thought of thee and loves thee no more. Dost thou believe it?" I took no time for thought, but answered at once without hesitation. "No, for if he does not love me, his spirit lies, and no spirit can lie." Another pause. Then the voice put this question: "Dost thou truly believe in God, thy Creator, the Maker of heaven and earth?" Lifting my eyes half in hope, half in appeal to the starry deep sky above me, I replied fervently, "I do believe in him with all my soul." A silence followed which seemed long and weighted with suspense. Then the voice spoke once more. "Dost thou believe in love, the generator of life, and the moving cause and mind of all created things?" And again I replied, "With all my soul." The figure now bent slightly towards me, and the light within its darkness became more defined and brilliant. Presently an arm and hand, white and radiant, a shape as of living flame, was slowly outstretched from the enfolding black draperies. It pointed steadily to the abyss below me. "If thy love is so great," said the voice, "if thy faith is so strong, if thy trust in God is sure and perfect, descend thither." I heard, but could not credit my own hearing. I gazed at the shrouded and veiled speaker, at the commanding arm that signed my mortal body to destruction. For a moment I was lost in wild terror and wilder doubt. Was this fearful suggestion a temptation or a test? Should it be obeyed? I strove to find the centre poise of my own self, to gather all my forces together, to make myself sure of my own will and responsible for my own deeds. And then, there I paused. All that was purely mortal in me shuddered on the brink of the unknown. One look upward to the soft gloom of the purple sky and its myriad stars, one horrified glance downward at the dark depth where I heard the roaring of the sea. I clasped my hands in a kind of prayerful desperation, and looked once more at the solemn shadow beside me. "If thy love is so great," it repeated in slow and impressive tones, "if thy faith is so strong, if thy trust in God is so sure and perfect." There came a moment of tense stillness, a moment in which my life seemed detached from myself, so that I held it like a palpitating separate creature in my hands. Suddenly the recollection of the last vision of all those I had seen among the dark mountains of Korosk came back to me vividly, that of the woman who had knelt outside a barred gate in heaven, waiting to enter in. "Oh, leave her not always exiled and alone," I had prayed then. "Dear God, have pity! Unbar the gate and let her in! She has waited so long!" A sob broke unconsciously from my lips. My eyes filled with burning tears that blinded me. Imploringly I turned towards the relentless figure beside me once more. Its hand still pointed downwards, and again I seemed to hear the words, "If thy love is so great, if thy faith is so strong, if thy trust in God is so sure and perfect." And then I suddenly found my own soul's centre, the very basis of my own actual being. And standing firmly upon that plane of imperishable force, I came to a quick resolve. "Nothing can destroy me," I said within myself. "Nothing can slay the immortal part of me, and nothing can separate my soul from the soul of my beloved. In all earth, in all heaven, there is no cause for fear." Hesitating no longer, I closed my eyes. Then extending my clasped hands, I threw myself forward and plunged into the darkness. Down, down, interminably down. A light followed me like a meteoric shaft of luminance piercing the blackness. I retained sufficient consciousness to wonder at its brilliancy, and for a time I was borne along in my descent as though on wings. Down, still down, and I saw ocean at my feet, a heaving mass of angry waters flecked with a wool-like fleece of foam. The change that is called death, but which is life! This was the only clear thought that flashed like lightning through my brain as I sank swiftly towards the engulfing desert of the sea. Then everything swirled into darkness and silence. A delicate warm glow like the filtering of sunbeams through shaded silk and crystal, a fragrance of roses, a delicious sound of harp-like music. To these things I was gradually awakened by a gentle pressure on my brows. I looked up, and my whole heart relieved itself into a long, deep sigh of ecstasy. It was Aselzion himself who bent over me, Aselzion whose grave blue eyes watched me with earnest and anxious solicitude. I smiled up at him in response to his wordless questioning as to how I felt, and would have risen but that he imperatively signed to me to lie still. "Rest," he said, and his voice was very low and tender. "Rest, poor child. You have done more than well." Another sigh of pure happiness escaped me. I stretched out my arms lazily, like one aroused from a long and refreshing slumber. My sensations were now perfectly exquisite. A fresh and radiant life seemed pouring itself through my veins, and I was content to remain a perfectly passive recipient of such an inflow of health and joy. The room I found myself in was new to me. It seemed made up of lovely colourings and a profusion of sweet flowers. I lay enshrined, as it were, in the centre of a little temple of beauty. I had no desire to move or to speak. Every trouble, every difficulty had passed from my mind, and I watched Aselzion dreamily as he brought a chair to the side of my couch and sat down. Then, taking my hand in his, felt my pulse with an air of close attention. I smiled again. "Does it still beat?" I asked, finding my voice suddenly. "Surely the great sea has drowned it." Still holding my hand, he looked full into my eyes. "Many waters cannot quench love," he quoted softly. "Dear child, you have proved that truth. Be satisfied." Raising myself on my pillows, I studied his grave face with an earnest scrutiny. "Tell me," I half whispered, "have I failed?" He pressed my hand encouragingly. "No, you have almost conquered." "Almost? Only almost?" I sank back again on the couch, wondering and waiting. He remained beside me, quite silent. After a little, the tension of suspense became unbearable, and I spoke again. "How did I escape?" I asked. "Who saved me when I fell?" He smiled gravely. "There was nothing to escape from," he answered, "and no one saved you since you were not in danger." "Not in danger?" I echoed, amazed. "No, only from yourself." I gazed at him utterly bewildered. He gave me a kind and reassuring glance. "Have patience," he said gently. "All shall be explained to you in good time. Meanwhile, this apartment is yours for the rest of your stay here, which will not now be long. I have had all your things removed from the probation room in the tower, so that you will no more be troubled by its scenic transformations." Here he smiled again. "I will leave you now to recover from the terrors through which you have passed so bravely. Rest and refresh yourself thoroughly, for you have nothing more to fear. When you are quite ready, touch this," and he pointed to a bell. "I shall hear its summons and will come to you at once." Before I could say a word to detain him, he had retired and I was left alone. I rose from my couch, and the first impression I had was that of a singular ease and lightness, a sense of physical strength and well-being that was delightful beyond expression. The loveliness and peace of the room in which I was enchanted me. Everything my eyes rested upon suggested beauty. The windows were shaded with rose silk hangings, and when I drew these aside I looked out on a marble loggia or balcony overhung with climbing roses. This, in its turn, opened on an exquisite glimpse of garden and blue sea. There was no clock anywhere to tell me the time of day, but the sun was shining, and I imagined it must be afternoon. Adjoining this luxurious apartment was an equally luxurious bathroom, furnished with every conceivable elegance. The bath itself was of marble, and the water bubbled up from its centre like a natural spring, sparkling as it came. I found all my clothes, books, and other belongings arranged with care where I could most easily get at them, and to my joy the book "The Secret of Life," which I thought I had lost on my last perilous adventure, lay on a small table by itself like a treasure set apart. I bathed and dressed quickly, allowing myself no time to think upon any strange or perplexing point in my adventures, but giving myself entirely up to the joy of the new and ecstatic life which thrilled through me. A mirror in the room showed me my own face, happy and radiant, my own eyes bright and smiling. No care seemed to have left a trace on my features, and I was fully conscious of a perfect strength and health that made the mere act of breathing a pleasure. In a very short time I was ready to receive Aselzion and I touched the bell he had indicated as the signal. Then I sat down by the window and looked out on the fair prospect before me. How glorious was the world, I thought, how full of perfect beauty, that heavenly blue of sky and sea melting into one, the tender hues of the clamouring roses against the green of the surrounding foliage, the lovely light that filtered through the air like powdered gold. Were not all these things to be thankful for? And can there be any real unhappiness so long as our souls are in tune with the complete harmony of creation? Hearing a step behind me, I rose, and with a glad smile stretched out my hands to Aselzion, who had just then entered. He took them in his own and pressed them lightly. Then, drawing a chair opposite to mine, he sat down. His face expressed a certain gravity, and his voice when he began to speak was low and gentle. "I have much to tell you," he said, "but I will make it as brief as I can. You came here to pass a certain psychic ordeal, and you have passed it successfully, all but the last phase. Of that we will speak presently. For the moment you are under the impression that you have been through certain episodes of a more or less perplexing and painful nature. So you have, but not in the way you think. Nothing whatever has happened to you save in your own mind. Your adventures have been purely mental, and were the result of several brains working on yours and compelling you to see and to hear what they chose. There, do not look so startled." For I had risen with an involuntary exclamation. "I will explain everything quite clearly, and you will soon understand." He paused, and I sat down again by the window, wondering and waiting. "In this world," he went on slowly, "it is not climate or natural surroundings that affect man so much as the influences brought to bear upon him by his fellow men. Human beings really live surrounded by the waves of thought flung off by their own brains and the brains of those around them, and this is the reason why, if they are not strong enough to find a centre poise, they are influenced by ways and moods of thought which would never be their own by choice and free will. If a mind, or let us say a soul, can resist the impressions brought to bear upon it by other forces than itself, if it can stand alone, clear of obstacle, in the light of the divine image, then it has gained a mastership over all things. But the attainment of such a position is difficult enough to be generally impossible. Influences work around us everywhere. Men and women with great aims in life are swept away from their intentions by the indifference or discouragement of their friends. Brave deeds are hindered from accomplishment by the suggestion of fears which do not really exist, and the daily scattering and waste of psychic force by disturbing or opposing brain waves is sufficient to make the world a perfect paradise were it used to that end." He waited a moment, then bent his eyes earnestly upon me as he resumed. "You do not need to be told by me that you have lived on this earth before, and that you have many times been gently yet forcibly drawn into connection with the other predestined half of yourself, that soul of love which, blindly seeking, you have often rejected when found. Not of yourself have you rejected it, but simply because of the influences around you to which you have yielded. Now, in this further phase of your existence, you have been given another chance, another opportunity. It is quite possible that had you not come to me, you would have lost your happiness again, and it was this knowledge which made me receive you, against all the rules of our order, when I saw that you were fairly resolved. Your ordeal would have been longer had you not made the first bold advance yourself on the occasion of your entrance into our chapel. The light of the cross and star drew you, and your soul obeyed the attraction of its native element. Had you opposed its intention by doubts and fears, I should have had more trouble with you than I should have cared to undertake. But you made the first step yourself with a rare courage. The rest was comparatively easy." He paused again, and again went on. "I have already said that you are under the impressions of having gone through certain adventures or episodes which have more or less distressed and perplexed you. These things have had no existence except in your mind. When I took you up to your room in the turret, I placed you under my influence, and under the influence of 4 other brains, acting in conjunction with myself. We took entire possession of your mentality, and made it as far as possible like a blank slate on which we wrote what we chose. The test was to see whether your soul, which is the actual you, could withstand and overcome our suggestions. At first hearing, this sounds as if we had played a trick upon you for our own entertainment, but it is not so. It is merely an application of the most powerful lesson in life, namely, the resistance and conquest of the influences of others, which are the most disturbing and weakening forces we have to contend with. I began to see clearly what he meant me to understand, and I hung upon his words with eager attention. "You have only to look about you in the world," he continued, "to realize the truth of what I say. Every day you may meet some soul whose powers of accomplishment might be superb if it were not for the restricting influences to which it allows itself to succumb. How often do you not come upon a man or woman of brilliant genius, who is nevertheless rendered incompetent by opposing influences, and who therefore lives the life of a bird in a cage? Take the thousands of men wrongly mated, whose very wives and children drag them down and kill every spark of ambition and accomplishment within them. Take the thousands of women persuaded or forced into unions with men whose low estimate of woman's intellect coarsens and degrades her to a level from which it is almost impossible to rise. This is the curse of influences, the magnetic currents of other brains which set our own awry and make half the trouble and mischief in the world. Not one soul in 100,000 has force or courage to resist them. The man accustomed to live with a wife who, without doing any other harm, simply kills his genius by the mere fact of her daily contact, moods, and methods, makes no effort to shake himself free from the apathy her influence causes, but simply sinks passively into inaction. The woman, bound to a man who insists on considering her lower than himself, and often pulled this way and that by the selfish desires or aims of her children or other family belongings, becomes a mere domestic drudge or machine, with no higher aims than are contained in the general ordering of household business. Love, the miraculous touchstone which turns everything to gold, is driven out of the circle of life, with the result that life itself grows weary of its present phase, and makes haste to seek another more congenial. Hence proceeds what we call age and death. I was about to interrupt by an eager question, but he silenced me by a gesture. "Your position," he went on, "from a psychic standard, which is the only necessary, because the only lasting attitude, is that of being brought into connection with the other half of your spiritual and immortal ego, which means the possession of perfect love, and with it perfect life. And because this is so great a gift, and so entirely divine, influences are bound to offer opposition in order that the soul may make its choice voluntarily. Therefore, when I, and the other brains acting with me, placed you under our power, we impressed you with all that most readily shakes the feminine mind, doubt, jealousy, suspicion, and all the wretched terrors these wretched emotions engender. We suggested the death of Raphael Santoris, as well as his treachery. You heard, as you thought, voices behind a wall, but there were no voices, only the suggestion of voices in your mind. You saw strange phantoms and shadows. They had no existence, except in so far as we made them exist and present themselves to your mental vision. You wandered away into unknown places, so you imagined, but as a matter of fact you never left your room." "Never left my room?" I echoed. "Oh, that cannot be!" "It can be, because it is," he answered me, smiling gravely. "The only thing in your experience that was real was the finding of the book The Secret of Life, in the purple draped shrine. Here it is," and he took it up from the table on which it lay. "And if you had turned it over a little more, you would have found this," and he read aloud: "All action is the material result of thought. Suffering is the result of thinking into pain. Disease the result of thinking into weakness. Every emotion is the result of wrong or right thinking, with one exception: love. Love is not an emotion, but a principle, and as the generator of life pervades all things and is all things, thought, working within this principle, creates the things of beauty and lastingness. Thought, working outside this principle, equally creates the things of terror, doubt, confusion, and destruction. There is no other secret of life, no other elixir of youth, no other immortality. He pronounced the last words with gentle and impressive emphasis, and a great sweetness and calm filled my mind as I listened. Or I should say we, for 4 of my brethren were deeply interested in you on account of the courage you had shown. We took you up to the utmost height of endurance in the way of mental terror, and, to our great joy, found your soul strong enough to baffle and conquer the ultimate suggestion of death itself. You held firmly to the truth that there is no death, and with that spiritual certainty risked all for love. Now we have released you from our spells." And his eyes were full of kindness as he looked at me. "And I want to know if you thoroughly realize the importance of the lesson we have taught." I met his inquiring glance fully and steadily. "I think I do," I said. "You mean that I must stand alone." "Alone, yet not alone," he answered, and his fine face was transfigured into light with its intense feeling and power. "Alone with love, which is to say, alone with God, and therefore surrounded by all God-like, lasting and revivifying things. You will go back from this place to the world of conventions, and you will meet a million influences to turn you from your chosen way. Opinion, criticism, ridicule, calumny, and downright misunderstanding. These will come out against you like armed foes, bristling at every point with weapons of offence. If you tell them of your quest of life and youth and love, and of your experience here, they will cover you with their mockery and derision. If you were to breathe a word of the love between you and Raphael Santoris, 1,000 efforts would be instantly made to separate you, one from the other, and snatch away the happiness you have won. How will you endure these trials? What will be your method of action?" I thought a moment. "The same that I have tried to practice here," I answered. "I shall believe nothing of ill report, but only of good." He bent his eyes upon me searchingly. "Remember," he said, "what force there is in a storm of opinion. The fiercest gale that ever blew down strong trees and made havoc of men's dwellings is a mere whisper compared with the fury of human minds set to destroy one heaven-aspiring soul. Think of the petty grudge borne by the loveless against love, the spite of the restless and unhappy against those who have won peace. All this you will have to bear, for the world is envious, and even a friend breaks down in the strength of friendship when thwarted or rendered jealous by a greater and more resistless power." I sighed a little. "I have few friends," I said, "certainly none that have ever thought it worth while to know my inner and truest self. Most of them are glad to be my friends if I go their way, but if I choose a way of my own, their friendship becomes mere quarrel. But I talk of choosing a way. How can I choose yet? You say my ordeal is not yet over?" "It will be over tonight," he answered, "and I have every hope that you will pass through it unflinchingly. You have not heard from Santoris?" The question gave me a little thrill of surprise. "Heard from him? No," I replied. "He never suggested writing to me." Aselzion smiled. "He is too closely in touch with you to need other correspondence," he said. "But be satisfied that he is safe and well. No misadventure has befallen him." "Thank God!" I murmured. "And if—" "If he loves you no more," went on Aselzion, "if he has made an error of selection, as the scientists would say, and is not even now sure of his predestined helper and inspirer whose love will lift him to the highest attainment, what then?" "What then? Why, I must submit," I answered slowly. "I can wait, even for another 1,000 years." There was a silence, during which I felt Aselzion's eyes upon me. Then he spoke again in a lighter tone. "Let us for a moment talk of what the world calls miracle," he said. "I believe you are just now conscious of perfect health, and of a certain joy in the mere fact of life. Is it not so?" Smiling, I bent my head in acquiescence. "Understand, then," he continued, "that while you control the life forces of which you are made, by the power of an all-commanding spirit, this perfect health, this certain joy will continue. And more than this, everything in nature will serve you to this end. You have but to ask your servants, and they will obey. Ask of the sun its warmth and radiance, it will answer with a quick bestowal. Ask of the storm and wind and rain their powers of passion, they will give you their all. Ask of the rose its fragrance and colour, and the very essence of it shall steal into your blood. There is nothing you shall seek that you will not find. Try your own powers now." And with the word he got up and opened the window a little wider, then signed to me to step out on the balcony. "Here are roses, climbing up on their appointed way. Bend them towards you by a single effort of the will." I gazed at him in complete surprise and bewilderment. His answering looks were imperative. "By a single effort of the will," he repeated. I obeyed him, raising my eyes to the roses where they clambered upward round the loggia. I inwardly commanded them to turn towards me. The effect was instantaneous. As though blown by a light breeze, they all bent down with their burden of bright blossom, some of the flowers touching my hands. "That would be called miraculous by the ignorant," said Aselzion, "and it is nothing more than the physical force of the magnetic light rays within you, which, being focused in a single effort, draw the roses down pliantly to your will. No more miracle is there in this than that of the common magnet which has been vainly trying to teach us lessons about ourselves these many years. Now relax your will." Again I obeyed, and the roses moved gently away and upward to their former branching height. "This is an object lesson for you," said Aselzion, smiling then. "You must understand that you are now in a position to draw everything to you as easily as you drew those roses. You can draw the germs of health and life to mix and mingle with your blood, or you can equally draw the germs of disease and disintegration. The action is with you. From the sun you can draw fresh fuel for your brain and nerves, from the air the sustenance you demand, from beautiful things their beauty, from wise things their learning, from powerful things their force. Nothing can resist the radiating energy you possess, if you only remember how to employ it. In every action it must be focused on the given point. It must not be disturbed or scattered. The more often it is used, the more powerful it becomes, the more all-conquering. But never forget that it must work within the creative principle of love, not outside it." I sat absorbed and half afraid. "And tonight?" I said softly. He rose from his chair and stood up to his full, superb stature, looking down upon me with a certain mingling of kindness and pity. "Tonight," he replied, "we shall send for you. You will confront the brethren as one who has passed the same mental test through which they are passing, and you will face the last fear. I do not think you will go back upon yourself. I hope not. I strongly desire you to keep your courage to the end." I ventured to touch his hand. "And afterwards?" I queried. He smiled. "Afterwards, life and its secrets are all with you." Chapter 20 of The Life Everlasting by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Statler. Into the Light. When I was left alone once more, I gave myself up to the enchanting sense of perfect happiness that now seemed to possess my whole being. The world of glorious nature showed me an aspect of brilliancy and beauty that could no more be shadowed by fear or foreboding. It was a mirror in which I saw reflected the perfect mind of the Divine. Nothing existed to terrify or daunt the advancing soul, which had become cognizant of its own capabilities, and which, by the very laws governing it, is preordained to rise to the utmost height of supernal power. I had dimly guessed this truth, but I had never surely known it till now. Now I recognized that everything is and must be subservient to this interior force which exists to replenish the earth and subdue it, and that nothing can hinder the accomplishment of its resolved will. As I sat by the window, thinking and dreaming, I began to wonder what would be the nature of that last fear of which Aselzion had spoken. Why should the word fear be mentioned, when there was no cause for fear of any kind? Fear can only arise from a sense of cowardice, and cowardice is the offspring of weakness. From this argument it followed that my strength was not yet thoroughly tested to Aselzion's satisfaction, that he still thought it possible that some latent weakness in my spirit might display itself on further trial. And I resolved that if such was his idea, he should be proved wrong. Nothing, I vowed, should move me now, not all the world arrayed in arms against me should hinder my advance towards the completion of myself in the love of my beloved. I have already said that there was no visible chronicle of time in the house of Aselzion, save such as was evidenced by the broadening or waning light of day. Just now I knew it was late afternoon, as the window where I sat faced the west, and the sun was sinking in a blaze of glory immediately opposite to me. Bars of gold and purple and pale blue formed a kind of cloud gateway across the heavens, and behind this the splendid orb shone in a halo of deep rose. Watching the royal pageantry of colour on all sides, I allowed myself to go forth, as it were, in spirit, to meet and absorb it. Inwardly I set my whole being in tune with the great wave of light which opened itself over the sea and land, and as I did so, found every nerve in my body thrilled with responsive ecstasy, even as harp-strings may be thrilled into sound by the sweep of the wind. I rose and went out through the loggia into the garden, feeling more like a disembodied spirit than a mortal. So light and free and joyous were my very movements, so entirely in unison was I with everything in nature. The sunset bathed me in its ruby and purple magnificence. I lifted my eyes to the heavens and murmured almost unconsciously, "Thank God for life! Thank God for love! Thank God for all that life and love must bring to me!" A seagull soaring inland flew over my head with a little cry. Its graceful poise reminded me of the days I had passed in Morton Harland's yacht, when I had watched so many of these snow-white creatures dipping into the waves and soaring up again to the skies. And on a sudden impulse I stretched out my hand, determining to stay the bird's flight, if I could, and bring it down to me. The effort succeeded, slowly, and as if checked by some obstacle it felt but could not see. The lovely winged thing swept round and round in an ever-descending circle, and finally alighted on my wrist. I held it so for a moment. It turned its head towards me, its ruby-brown eyes sparkling in the sun. Then I tossed it off again into the air of its own freedom, where after another circling sweep or two it disappeared, and I walked on in a happy reverie, realizing that what I could do with the visible things of nature I could do as easily with the invisible. A sense of power vibrated through me. Footnote: the philosophy of Plato teaches that man originally, by the power of the divine image within him, had immediate command of the whole of nature, but gradually lost this power through his own fault. End of footnote. Power to command and power to resist. Power that forbade all hesitation, vacillation, or uncertainty. Power which, being connected by both physical and spiritual currents with this planet, the earth, and the atmosphere by which it is surrounded, lifts all that it desires towards itself as it rejects what it does not need. Returning slowly through the garden, and lingering by the beds of flowers that adorned it, I noticed how, when I bent over any particular blossom, it raised itself towards me as though drawn upward by a magnet. I was not inclined to gather a single one for my own pleasure. Some occult sympathy had become established between me and these beautiful creations, and I could no more sever a rose from its stem than I could kill a bird that sang its little song to me. On re-entering my room, I found the usual refection prepared for me, fresh fruit and bread and water, the only kind of food I was allowed. It was quite sufficient for me. In fact, I had not felt at any time the sensation of hunger. I began to wonder how long I had been a probationer in the house of Aselzion. Days or weeks? I could not tell. I was realizing the full truth that with the things of the infinite, time has no existence, and I recalled the verse of an ancient psalm. 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone, short as the watch that ends the night before the rising sun. And while my thoughts ran in this groove, I opened the book of the Secret of Life, and, as if in answer to my inward communing, found the following. The Delusion of Time. Time has no existence outside this planet. Humanity counts its seasons, its days and hours by the sun, but beyond the sun there are millions and trillions of other and larger suns, compared with which our guiding orb is but a small star. Out in the infinitude of space there is no time, but only eternity. Therefore, the soul which knows itself to be eternal should associate itself with eternal things, and should never count its existence by years. To its being there can be no end, therefore it never ages and never dies. It is only the sham religionists who talk of death. It is only the inefficient and unspiritual who talk of age. The man who allows himself to sink into feebleness and apathy merely because of the passing of years has some mental or spiritual weakness in him which he has not the will to overcome. The woman who suffers her beauty and freshness to wane and fade on account of what she or her dearest friends are pleased to call age shows that she is destitute of spiritual self-control. The soul is always young, and its own radiation can preserve the youth of the body in which it dwells. Age and decrepitude come to those with whom the soul is an unknown quantity. The soul is the only barrier against the forces of disintegration which break down effete substances in preparation for the change which humanity calls death. If the barrier is not strong enough, the enemy takes the city. These facts are simple and true, too simple and too true to be accepted by the world. The world goes to church and asks a divinity to save its soul, practically showing in all its ways of society and government an utter disbelief in the soul's existence. Men and women die when they might as well have lived. If we examine into the cause of their deaths, we shall find it in the manner of their lives. Obstinacy and selfishness have murdered more human beings than any other form of plague. The blasphemy of sham religion has insulted the majesty of the Creator more than any other form of sin, and He has answered it by His supreme silence. The man who attends a ritual of prayer which he does not honestly believe in, merely for the sake of social custom and observance, is openly deriding his Maker, and the priests who gain their living out of such ritual are trading on the divine. Let the people of this earth be taught that they live not in time, but in eternity, that their thoughts, words, and deeds are recorded minutely and accurately, and that each individual human unit is expected to contribute towards the general beauty and adornment of God's scheme of perfection. Every man, every woman must give of his or her best. The artist must give his noblest art, not for what it brings to him personally of gain or renown, but for what it does to others in the way of uplifting. The poet must give his highest thought, not for praise, but for love. The very craftsman must do his best and strongest work, not for the coin paid, but for the fact that it is work, and as such must be done well. and no workers must imagine that they can waste the forces wherewith they have been endowed, for no waste and no indolence is permitted, and in the end no selfishness. The attitude of the selfish human being is pure disintegration, a destroying microbe which crumbles and breaks down the whole constitution, not only ruining the body but the mind, and frequently making havoc of the very wealth that has been too selfishly guarded. For wealth is ephemeral as fame. Only love and the soul are the lasting things of God, the makers of life and the rulers of eternity. So far I read. Then, laying down my book, I listened. Music, solemn and exquisitely beautiful, stole on my ears from the far distance. It seemed to float through the open window as though in a double chorus, rising from the sea and falling from the heavens. Delicious harmonies trembled through the air, soft as fine rain falling on roses, and with their penetrating tenderness 1,000 suggestions, 1,000 memories came to me, all infinitely sweet. I began to think that even if Raphael Santoris were separated from me by some mischance, or changed to me in any way, it need not affect me overmuch, so long as I cherished the love I had for him in my own soul. Our passion was of a higher quality than the merely material. It was material and spiritual together, the spiritual predominating, thus making of it the only passion that can last. What difference could a few years more or less bring if we were bound by the eternal laws governing us to become united in the end? The joy of life is to love rather than to be loved, and the recipient of love is never so fully conscious of perfect happiness as the giver. The music went on in varying moods of lovely harmony, and my mind, like a floating cloud, drifted lazily above the waves of sound. I thought compassionately of the unrest and discontent of thousands who devote themselves to the smallest and narrowest aims in life, people with whom the loss of a mere article of wearing apparel is more important than a national difficulty, people who devote all their faculties to social schemes of self-aggrandizement, people who discuss trifles till discussion is worn threadbare, and ears are tired and brain is weary, people who, assuming to be religious and regular churchgoers, yet do the meanest things, and have no scruple in playing the part of tale-bearer and mischief-maker, setting themselves deliberately to break friendships and destroy love, people who talk of God as though He were their intimate, and who have by their very lives drawn everything of God out of them. I thought of all these, I say, and then I thought how different this world would be if men would hold by the noblest ideals, and suffer the latent greatness in them to have its way. If they would truly rule their own universe, and not allow its movement to fall into chaos, how fair life would become, how replete with health and joy, what a paradise would be created around us, and what constant benediction we should draw down upon us from the Most High. Gradually, as I sat absorbed in my own reveries, the afternoon waned into twilight, and twilight into dusk. One star, brilliant as a great diamond, flashed out suddenly above a rift of cloud, and a soft darkness began to creep stealthily over sky and sea. I moved away from the window and paced slowly up and down the room, waiting and wondering. The music still continued, but it had now grown slower and more solemn, and sounded like a great organ being played in a cathedral. It impressed me with a sense of prayer and praise, more of praise than prayer, for I had nothing to pray for, God having given me my own soul, which was all. As the darkness deepened, a soft, suffused light illumined the room, and I now noticed that it was the surface of the walls that shone in this delicate yet luminous way. I put my hand on the wall nearest to me. It was quite cold to the touch, yet bright to the eyes, and was no more fatiguing to look at than sunshine on a landscape. I could not understand how the light was thus arranged and used, but its effect was beautiful. As I walked to and fro, looking at the various graceful and artistic objects which adorned the room, I perceived an easel on which a picture was placed with a curtain of dark velvet drawn across it. Moved by curiosity, I drew the curtain aside, and my heart gave a quick bound of delight. It was an admirably painted portrait of Raphael Santoris. The grave blue eyes looked into my own, a smile rested on the firm, handsome mouth. The whole picture spoke to me and seemed to ask, "Wherefore didst thou doubt?" I stood gazing at it for several minutes enrapt, realizing how much even the counterfeit presentment of a beloved face may mean. And then I began to think how strange it is that we never seem ready to admit the strong insistence of nature on individuality and personality. Up at a vast height above the earth, and looking down upon a crowd of people from the car of a balloon or from an aeroplane, all human beings look the same, just one black mass of tiny moving units. But in descending among them, we find every face and figure wholly different, and though all are made on the same model, there are no two alike. Yet there are many who argue and maintain that though individual personality in bodies may be strongly marked, there is no individual personality in souls, ergo that nature thinks so little of the intelligent spirit inhabiting a mortal form that she limits individuality to that which is subject to change and has no care for it in that which is eternal. Such an hypothesis is absurd on the face of it, since it is the soul that gives individuality to the body. The individual personality of Raphael Santoris, expressed even in his painted portrait, appealed to me as being that of one I had loved long and tenderly. There was no strangeness in his features, but only an adorable familiarity. Long, long ago, in centuries that had proved like mere days down the vista of time, the soul in those blue eyes had looked love into mine. I recognized their tender, half-entreating, half-commanding gaze. I knew the little fleeting, wistful smile which said so little and yet so much. I felt that the striving, ambitious spirit of this man had sought mine as the help and completion of his own uplifting, and that I had misunderstood him and turned from him at the crucial moment when all might have been well. And I studied his picture long and earnestly, so moved by its aspect that I found myself talking to it softly, as though it were a living thing. "I wonder if I shall ever meet you again," I murmured. "Will you come to me? Or shall I go to you? How shall we find each other? When shall I be able to tell you that I know you now to be the only beloved, the one centre of my life round which all other things must for evermore revolve, the very mainspring of my best thought and action, the God of my universe, from whose love and pleasure spring the light and splendour of creation? When shall I see you again to tell you all that my heart longs to express? When may I fold myself in your arms as a bird folds its wings in a nest, and be at peace, knowing that I have gained the summit of all ambition and desires in love's perfect union? When shall we attune our lives together in that harmonious chord which shall sound its music sweetly through eternity? When shall our souls make a radiant one, through which God's power and benediction shall vibrate like living fire, creating within us all beauty, all wisdom, all courage, all supernal joy? For this is bound to be our future. But when? Moved by my own imagining, I stretched out my arms to the picture of my love, and tears filled my eyes. I was nothing but the weakest of mortals in the sudden recollection of the happiness I might have won long ago, had I been wise in time. A door opened quietly behind me, and I turned round quickly. Aselzion's messenger, Honorius, stood before me, and I greeted him with a smile, though my eyes were wet. "Have you come to fetch me?" I asked. "I am ready." He inclined his head a little. "You are not quite ready," he said, and with the word he gave into my hands a folded garment and veil. "You must attire yourself in these. I will wait for you outside." He retired and left me, and I quickly changed my own things for those which had been brought. They were easily put on, as they consisted simply of one long white robe, of a rather heavy make of soft silk, and a white veil which covered me from head to foot. My attiring took me but a few minutes, and when all was done I touched the bell by which I had previously summoned Aselzion. Honorius entered at once. His looks were grave and preoccupied. "If you should not return to this room," he said slowly, "is there any message, any communication you would like me to convey to your friends?" My heart gave a quick bound. There was some actual danger in store for me then? I thought for a moment, then smiled. "None," I answered. "I shall be able to attend to all such personal matters myself, afterwards." Honorius looked at me, and his handsome but rather stern face was grave, even to melancholy. "Do not be too sure," he said in a low tone. "It is not my place to speak, but few pass the ordeal to which you are about to be subjected. Only 2 have passed it in 10 years. "And one of these 2 was?" For an answer he pointed to the portrait of Santoris, thus confirming my instinctive hope and confidence. "I am not afraid," I said, "and I am ready to follow you now, wherever you wish me to go." He made no further remark, and turning round, led the way out of the apartment. We went down many stairs and through many corridors, some dimly lit, some scarcely illumined at all. The night had now fully come, and through 1 or 2 of the windows we passed I could see the dark sky patterned with stars. We came to the domed hall where the fountain played, and this was illumined by the same strange, all-penetrating light I had previously noticed. The lovely radiance played on the spray of the fountain, making the delicate frontage of ferns and palms and the hues of flowers look like a dream of fairyland. Passing through the hall, I followed my guide down a dark, narrow passage. Then I found myself suddenly alone. Guided by the surging sound of organ music, I went on, and all at once saw a broad stream of light pouring out from the open door of the chapel. Without a moment's hesitation I entered, then paused. The symbol of the cross and star flamed opposite to me, and on every side, wherever I looked, there were men in white robes, with cowls thrown back on their shoulders, all standing in silent rows, watching me as I came. My heart beat quickly, my nerves thrilled. I trembled as I walked, thankful for the veil that partially protected me from that multitude of eyes. Eyes that looked at me in wonder, but not unkindly. Eyes that mutely asked questions never to be answered. Eyes that said as plainly as though in actual speech, "Why are you among us? You, a woman! Why should you have conquered difficulties which we have still to overcome? Is it pride, defiance, or ambition with you, or is it all love?" I felt 1,000 influences moving around me. The power of many brains at work silently cross-examined my inner spirit, as though it were a witness in defense of some great argument. But I made up my mind not to yield to the overpowering nervousness and sudden alarm of my own position which threatened to shake my self-control. I fixed my eyes on the glittering symbol of the cross and star and moved on slowly. I must have looked a strangely solitary creature, draped in white like a victim for sacrifice, and walking all alone towards those burning, darting rays of light which enveloped the whole of the chapel in a flood of almost blinding splendour. The music still thundered on round me, and I thought I heard voices far off singing. I could distinguish words that came falling through the music, like blossoms falling through rain. Into the light, into the heart of the fire, to the innermost core of the deathless flame I ascend, I aspire. Under me rolls the whirling earth, with the noise of a myriad wheels that run ever round and about the sun. Over me circles the splendid heaven, strewn with the stars of morn and even, and I, the queen of my soul serene, float with my rainbow wings unfurled, alone with love, twixt God and the world. My heart beat rapidly, every nerve in me trembled, yet I went on resolvedly, not allowing myself to even think of danger. And then I saw Aselzion transfigured into an almost supernatural beauty of aspect by the radiance which bathed him in its lustrous glory. Aselzion with outstretched hands beckoning me towards him. and as I approached, I instinctively sank on my knees. The music died away suddenly, and there was a profound silence. I felt, though I could not see, that the eyes of all present were fixed upon me, and Aselzion spoke. "Rise," he said, and his voice was clear and imperative. "Not here must thou kneel, not here must thou rest. Rise and go onward. Thou hast gone far, but the way is still beyond. The gate of the last probation stands open. Enter, and may God be thy guide." I rose as he commanded me, and a dazzling flash of light struck my eyes as though the heavens had opened. The blazing cross and star became suddenly severed in two separate portions, dividing asunder and disclosing what seemed to be a hall of living fire. Flames of every colour burned vividly, leaping and falling without pause or cessation. It was a kind of open furnace in which surely everything must be consumed. I looked at Aselzion in silent enquiry, not in fear, and in equally silent answer he pointed to the glowing vault. I understood, and without another moment's hesitation I advanced towards it. As in a dream, I heard a kind of murmuring behind me, and suppressed exclamations from the students or disciples of Aselzion, who were all assembled in the chapel, but I paid no heed to this. My whole soul was set on fulfilling the last task demanded of me. Step by step I went on. I passed Aselzion with a smile. "Goodbye," I murmured. "We shall meet again." And then I advanced towards the leaping flames. I felt their hot breath on my cheeks. The scorching wind of them lifted my hair through the folds of my veil. An idea came upon me that for some cause or other I was now to experience that change which men call death, and that through this means I should meet my beloved on the other side of life. And with his name on my lips and a passionate appeal to him in my heart, I stepped into the glowing fire. As I did so, I lost sight of Aselzion, of the chapel, all those who watched my movements, and found myself surrounded on all sides by darting points of light, which, instead of scorching and withering me like a blown leaf in a storm, were like cool and fragrant showers playing all over me. Amazed, I went on, and as I went grew bolder. At one step I was bathed in a rain of delicate rays like sparkling diamond and topaz. At another, a lovely violet light shrouded me in its rich hues. At another, I walked in melting azure like the hues of a summer sky. And the farther in I went, the deeper and more glowing was the light about me. I felt it penetrating every pore of my skin. I held my hands out to it, and saw them look transparent in the fine luminance. And presently, gaining courage, I threw back my veil and breathed in the radiance as one breathes the air. My whole body grew light, and moved as though it floated rather than walked. I looked with unfatigued, undazzled eyes at the glittering flames sparkling harmlessly about me, which changed to lovely shapes of flowers and leaves beneath my feet, and arched themselves over my head like branches of shading trees. And then, all at once, down the long vista I caught sight of a shape like that of an angel that waited for me with watchful eyes and outstretched arms. It was but a moment that I saw this vision, and yet I knew what it meant, and I pressed on and on with all my soul rising in me, as it were, to go forth and reach that companion of itself which stood waiting with such tender patience. The light around me now changed to waves of intense luminance, which swept upon me like waves of the sea, and I allowed myself to be borne along with them, I knew not whither. All at once I saw a vast pillar of fire which seemed to block my way. Pausing for a moment, I looked and saw it break asunder and form the cross and star. I gazed upward, wondering. Its rays descending seemed to pierce my eyes, my brain, my very soul. I sprang forward, dazed and dazzled, murmuring, "Let this be the end!" Someone caught me in his arms. Someone drew me to his breast, holding me there as if I were the dearest possession of all the world or life or time could give. And a voice infinitely tender answered me. "Not the end, but the endless, my beloved. mine at last, and mine forever, in triumph, in victory, in perfect joy. And then I knew that I had found my love, that it was Raphael Santoris who thus held me in his close embrace, that I had fulfilled my own desire, which was to prove my faith if not my worthiness, that I had won all I wanted in this world and the next, and that nothing could ever separate our souls, one from the other, again. This is the deep eternal ecstasy of a knowledge divinely shared by the very angels of God, and of such supernal happiness nothing can be said or written. I pen these last words on the deck of the Dream with my beloved beside me. The sun is sinking in a glory of crimson. We are about to anchor in still waters. A rosy light flashes on our wonderful white sails, which will be presently furled, and we shall sit together, Raphael and I, watching the night draw its soft dark curtain around us, and the stars come out in the sky like diamonds embroidered on deep purple velvet, and listening to the gentle murmur of the little waves breaking into a rocky corner of the distant shore. And the evening will close on a day of peace and happiness, one of the many unwearying beautiful days which, like a procession of angels, brings us new and ever more perfect joy. More than a year has elapsed since my probation in the house of Aselzion, since we, my beloved and I, knelt before the Master and received his blessing on our eternal union. In that brief time I have lost all my worldly friends and acquaintances, who have, if I may so express it, become afraid of me. Afraid chiefly because I possess all that the world can give me without their advice and assistance, and not only afraid but offended because I have found the companion of my soul with whom they have nothing in common. They look upon me as lost to society, and cannot realize how much such loss is gain. Meanwhile we, Raphael and I, live our own radiant and happy lives in full possession of all that makes life sweet and valuable, and wanting nothing that our own secret forces cannot supply. Wealth is ours, one of the least among the countless gifts Nature provides for those among her children who know where to find her inexhaustible riches. And we also enjoy the perfect health which accompanies the constant inflowing of an exhaustless vitality. The things we attain seem miraculous to others, so that even while accepting help and benefit at our hands, they frown and shake their heads at the attitude we assume towards social hypocrisies and conventions. But we are nevertheless able to create such influences around us that none come near us without feeling stronger, better, and more content. And this is the utmost we are permitted to do for our fellow creatures, inasmuch as none will listen to argument, and none will follow advice. The most ardent soul that ever dwelt in human form cannot lead another soul in the way of lasting life or lasting happiness if it refuses to go. And there is no more absolute truth than this, that each man and each woman must make his or her own destiny both here and hereafter. This is the law which changes not, and which can never be subject to the slightest variation. Forgiveness of sins there is none, since every trespass against law carries its own punishment. Necessity for prayer there is none, since every faithful wish and desire of the soul is granted without parley. Necessity for praise there is much, since the soul lives and grows in the glory of its Creator. And the whole secret of everlasting life and happiness is contained in the full possession and control of the divine centre of ourselves, this radia or living flame, which must be dual in order to be perfect, and which, in its completed state, is an eternal force which nothing can destroy and nothing can resist. All nature harmonizes with its action, and from nature it draws its perpetual sustenance and increasing power. To me and to my beloved, the world is a garden of paradise, rich with beauty and delight. We live in it as a part of its loveliness. We draw into our own organizations the warmth of the sunlight, the glory of colour, the songs of sweet birds, the fragrance of flowers, and the exquisite vibrations of the light and air. Like two notes of a perfect chord, we sound our lives on the keyboard of the Infinite, and we know that the music will become fuller and sweeter as the eternal seasons roll on. If it is asked why there should have been any necessity to pass through the psychic ordeal imposed on me by Aselzion, I reply, look at the world in which men and women generally live, and say frankly whether its ways are such as to engender happiness. Look at society, look at politics, look at commerce, all mere schemes for self-aggrandizement. And more than all, look at the sham of modern religion. Is it not too often a mere blasphemy and affront to the majesty of the divine? And are not many, if not all, these mistakes against nature, these offences against eternal law, the result of man's own influence working in opposition to the very decrees of God, which he disobeys even while recognizing that they exist? The chief point of Aselzion's instruction was the test of the brain and soul against influences, the opposing influences of others, and this is truly the chief hindrance to all spiritual progress. The coward sentiment of fear itself is born in us through the influence of timorous persons, and it is generally the dread of what other people will say, or what other people will think, that holds us back from performing many a noble action. It should be thoroughly understood that in the eternal advancement of one's own soul, other people and their influences are hindrances to progress. It does not matter a jot what anybody thinks or says, provided the central altar of one's own spirituality is clear and clean for the steadfast burning of the dual flame of life and love. All opinion, all criticism becomes absurd in such matters as these, and absolutely worthless. It does not affect me that anyone outside my sphere of thought should be incredulous of my beliefs, nor can it move me from my happiness to know that persons who live their lives on a lower plane consider me a fool for electing to live mine on the highest. I take joy in the fact that even in so selfish and material an age as this, Aselzion still has his students and disciples, a mere handful out of the millions, it is true, but still sufficient to keep the beautiful truth of the soul's power alive and helpful to the chosen few. For such who have studied these truths and have mastered them sufficiently to practice them in the ordinary round of existence, life presents an ever-living happiness and offers daily proof that there is no such thing as death. Youth remains where love is, and beauty stays with health and vitality. Decay and destruction are changes which are brought about by apathy of the will and indifference to the soul's existence. And the same law which gives the soul its supreme sovereignty equally works for its release from effete and inactive substances. To those who would ask me how I am able to hold and keep the treasures of life, love, and youth, which the majority of mankind are forever losing, I answer that I can say no more than I have said, and the lesson which all may learn is contained in what I have written. It is no use arguing with those whom no argument will convince, or trying to teach those who will not be taught. We, my beloved and I, can only prove the truth of the soul's absolute command over all spiritual, material, and elemental forces by our one life and the way we live it. We, to whom everything that is necessary and desirable for our progress comes on demand. We, whom science serves as an Aladdin's lamp, realizing every imaginable delight. We, with whom love, which with many human beings is judged the most variable and transitory of emotions, is the very principle of life, the very essence of the waves of the air through which we move and have our being. The attainment of such happiness as ours is possible to all, but there is only one way of attainment, and the clue to that way is in the soul of each individual. Each one must find it and follow it, regardless of all influences which may be brought to bear on his or her actions. Each one must discover the centre poise of life's movement and firmly abide by it. It is the immortal creature in each one of us whose destiny is to make eternal progress and advancement through endless phases of life, love, and beauty, and when once we know and admit the actual existence of this immortal center, we shall realize that with it all things are possible, save death. Radiating outward from itself, it can preserve the health and youth of the body it inhabits indefinitely, till of its own desire it seeks a higher plane of action. Radiating inwardly, it is an irresistible attractive force, drawing to itself the powers and virtues of the planet on which it dwells, and making all the forces of visible and invisible nature subject to its will and command. This is one of those great truths which the world denies, but which it is destined to learn within the next 2,000 years. If anyone should desire to know the fate of Morton Harland and his daughter, that fate has been precisely what they themselves brought about by their way of life and action. Morton Harland himself died, as the world puts it, of a painful and lingering disease which could have been cured had he chosen to take the means offered to him through Raphael Santoris. He did not choose, therefore the end was inevitable. Catherine married Dr. Braille, and they two now live a sufficiently wretched life together. She, a moping, querulous invalid, and he, as a society physician, possessed of great wealth and the position wealth brings. We never meet. Our ways are now forever sundered. Mine is the upward and onward path, and with my beloved I ascend the supernal heights where the shadow of evil never falls, and where the secret of life is centered in the spirit of love. The End. End of Chapter 20. End of The Life Everlasting, A Reality of Romance by Marie Corelli.